This joint subcommittee will come to order. Members may be coming in and out due to a Judiciary Committee markup. See?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to begin by welcoming our subcommittee members to this first session of the 115th Congress. Welcome to each and every one of you. I know that Ranking Member Deutsch and I are looking forward to continuing the bipartisan work of the last Congress to further advance our foreign policy objectives in the Middle East and North Africa and to carry out our important oversight role. We're eager to get back to work and pleased to welcome back our returning members, and we're excited to work closely with our new members. After recognizing myself, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Deutsch, and Ranking Member Bass for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses. Thank you for being here. And without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. 2 months ago, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2334 by a vote of 14-0, with the United States abstaining. It was a departure in policy by the Obama administration, and it was a move that was opposed by many of us in Congress, some arguing correctly that Resolution 2334 has no real practical impact. But those who make this argument fail to see 2334 as part of a larger agenda, one piece of a larger plan by the Palestinians to undermine, isolate, and delegitimize Israel. The real practical impact of 2334 is that it leaves the possibility of peace even more remote. But that is by design. Abu Mazen and the current Palestinian Authority leadership have abandoned any pretense that they are interested in making peace with Israel. Instead, for years, they have been orchestrating a push at the United Nations to achieve unilateral statehood outside of direct negotiations with the Jewish state. And last year, this push reached new heights. UNESCO's Executive Board and the World Heritage Committee both passed similar resolutions rewriting history and distancing Jewish and Christian ties to Jerusalem. The Human Rights Council, UNHRC, approved a blacklist that can be used by those who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS movement, to further undermine Israel. And these efforts culminated with the passage of Resolution 2334. After years of failed attempts at peace and years of false moral equivalence between Israeli and the Palestinians, we have an opportunity to reassess our relationship and our objectives. The push at the UN by the Palestinians has created an atmosphere of complete mistrust for the Israelis, almost to the point of no return. We now have an opportunity to grow and strengthen our alliance with Israel and show the world that we support our friends. We don't leave them out to dry. At the same time, we cannot continue to pursue a failed policy with the Palestinian Authority. We must reconsider our current assistance programs for the PA and our relationship with Abu Mazen. It is past time for the United States to hold Abu Mazen and the Palestinian leadership accountable for its actions at the UN, for its incitement to violence, and for its unwillingness to curb the violence and work with Israel to achieve a lasting peace. Continuing to provide assistance to the Palestinian Authority has proven that it does nothing to further the prospects for peace as long as Abu Mazen has no interest in working with the Israelis. We must also take a long, hard look at what our role at the United Nations is. This is why I intend on reintroducing legislation that would address the need for reforms at the United Nations, because it is clear that engagement with the UN over the past several years has only served to legitimize its anti-Israel agenda. This is common sense legislation that is intended on forcing some of the much-needed reforms to get the UN and its specialized agencies back to doing what they were mandated to do. I think many of us could agree that it makes sense to have a uniform definition of refugee, and that all refugees should be under the auspices of a single agency. We could all be in agreement that the body meant to promote and defend human rights worldwide should not be controlled by nations that have some of the worst human rights records. And it makes sense that the body tasked with ensuring the protection of cultural and historic heritage should not be used as a political tool to deny or erase the cultural and historic ties of a people to their homeland. Too many countries see the United Nations for what it is supposed to be, not for what it truly is, unwilling to come to the hard realization that we need to take a drastic new approach if we are to salvage the mission of the United Nations. It has become a politicized tool used more to block action or maintain the status quo. And it has become the place where the world's dictators come together to demonize Israel because it's so easy to do. I have known the new Secretary General for quite some time now, and I know that he would agree that we can and must do better. I hope to work with him in the future as we tackle this difficult but necessary task, and I hope that the Trump administration will work to bring reform to the UN so that it can work as it was intended to do. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Chairman Smith, thanks for calling today's joint hearing. I'm pleased to join Ranking Member Bass in welcoming the new members of our subcommittees to the first hearing of this new Congress. I look forward to continuing to work with the chairman to advance our shared foreign policy priorities, and would be happy to revisit her comments from last Congress, in which she refers to me as her co-chairman. Today, we have the opportunity to look at the challenges for the new administration in advancing the interests of the United States and our allies in the United Nations, while continuing to advance the prospects for a two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinians. I'm pleased to welcome our witnesses to what will no doubt be a spirited and thought-provoking discussion. Like many of my colleagues, I've long spoken out in no uncertain terms against the pervasive anti-Israel bias of the United Nations. In 2015, I was invited to speak at the UN General Assembly's special session on anti-Semitism, where I raised the very issue of the anti-Israel nature of the UN bodies. It is simply fact that no other country has been subject to as many country-specific resolutions at the United Nations as Israel. It is simply fact that there are states who seek to use the United Nations to delegitimize Israel's very right to exist, and at every opportunity, the United States, as Israel's friend and ally, must push back against those efforts. The UN Security Council has proven it is not the forum for a balanced discussion on issues pertaining to Israel. Efforts to use the United Nations to bypass direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians must be rejected, and this Congress must affirm regularly that direct negotiations between the parties themselves is the only path to two states for two peoples living side by side in peace and security. Last year, the four chairs and ranking members of these subcommittees joined our colleagues Kay Granger and Nita Lowey in authoring a letter signed by 394 members of Congress that reaffirmed that very principle. In that letter, we also expressed concern that one-sided initiatives may arise at the UN and that such initiatives would hinder the prospects for peace. I was among the members of Congress that was troubled by the U.S. decision to allow UN Security Council Resolution 2334 to pass in December. Many of my colleagues shared the belief that the Security Council was the wrong venue for this resolution. Dozens of clauses on Israeli settlement activity, followed by one vague reference to all sides condemning violence, didn't make it balanced. Moreover, even for those who believe it's necessary to make a statement on settlement activity, the resolution did not even distinguish between Jewish prayer at the Western Wall and illegal outposts. I am concerned about the prospects for a two-state solution. I'm concerned, too, that Palestinian incitement and terror attacks and rockets aimed at Israeli civilians harm these prospects, but I didn't see that in the resolution. But I want to be clear, U.S. disengagement from the United Nations does nothing to help our friend and ally, Israel. It does nothing to bring Israel and the Palestinians closer to negotiations, and disengagement at the United Nations will almost certainly lead to the passage of resolutions that are significantly harmful to Israel's interests. I agree with my colleagues that the UN system needs real reform, and I look forward to having a discussion today on how we can alter the current assessment rate for our dues, or remove the outrageous standing agenda item on Israel from the UN Human Rights Council's agenda, or create criteria for membership standards on the Council so that the world's worst human rights abusers don't have a seat at the table. But I also know that cutting off funding or full disengagement from the UN will significantly harm the interests of this country and our allies. The UN is instrumental in preventing disease pandemics, maternal and child health, refugee issues, and I know that Ranking Member Bass will speak in more detail about the benefits of UN engagement. I'd like to simply point out that despite the way it's treated in the UN system, Israel does not disengage from it. In fact, it's the opposite. Israel works harder to strengthen its diplomatic relations. Israel is seeking a seat on the Security Council in 2019. Israel was granted unprecedented membership in the Western European and other group. And at first, Israel was elected to chair the UN Legal Committee last year. And Israel is no greater advocate at the UN than the United States. It is when we do not have a seat at the table, it is when we are not paying our dues, that we lose the ability to help our ally. Despite my deep disdain for the way the Human Rights Council is run, in the years from 2006 to 2009 that the United States was not on the Council, there were 6 special sessions on Israel. Since 2009, with our engagement, there has been 1. Madam Chairman, if we want to see Israel thrive as the vibrant, innovative democracy it is, we will stand up for it at the United Nations. We will be the ones to make the world see Israel for what it really is, a country that values equality in education, a world leader in tech and biomedical research and agriculture, and provides life-saving humanitarian aid, all as a thriving democracy. If we want to foster an environment for a return to direct negotiations in hopes of reaching a two-state solution, we will be there at the UN to ensure that it is not used as a venue to bypass negotiations, and we will help engage other member states to understand why supporting boycotts against Israel does nothing to advance peace. As we look to the challenges facing this new administration, we've got to consider what actions and what policies strengthen Israel's security and bring Israel and the Palestinians closer to direct negotiations that will lead to 2 states. One thing is certain: should the Palestinians choose to pursue the reckless action of bypassing direct negotiations for UN action, the United States must be engaged and involved and at the table to prevent it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch, my co-chair. And now I'd like to yield for his opening statement to Chairman Smith, chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen. And I want to thank you for your leadership and for inviting my subcommittee to join yours. I think it adds additional focus and hopefully firepower to this extremely important hearing. Madam Chair, the United Nations is an organization, as we all know, founded on the loftiest of principles out of the ashes of World War II. Indeed, if we look at the context of the founding of the UN and the great document that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which sets forth its animating aspirational principles, we understand how the world came together to say, never again. Never again would a people be subject to genocide. Never again would military aggression destroy the peace of smaller nations. Rather, a forum would be created for these nations, big and small, old and new, to come together to settle their differences in a peaceful way. Yet despite these lofty principles, the State of Israel finds itself in the crosshairs of a delegitimization campaign mounted by a growing number of nations in the United Nations and especially in UN institutions. You know, back in 2004, I chaired more than 20 hearings on combating anti-Semitism. Twice, Natan Sharansky testified at those hearings, and he pointed out, and it bears quoting, that classical anti-Semitism is aimed at the Jewish people or the Jewish religion. The new anti-Semitism is aimed at the Jewish state. Since this anti-Semitism can hide behind the veneer of a legitimate criticism of Israel, it is more difficult to expose. He pointed out, making the task harder, is that this hatred is advanced in the name of values most of us would consider unimpeachable, such as human rights. He calls it the 3 Ds: demonization, double standards, and the idea of delegitimization. And without objection, I'd like his full statement at that
Without
hearing
objection.
included in the record. Today, this offensive against Israel is unparalleled in its intensity and absurdity on the international stage. No other nation on earth faces such a concerted effort to rewrite its history, erase millennia of its cultural heritage, and violate its sovereignty. Indeed, among the foundational documents of the UN is the Charter, which at its very beginning set forth on the basis of the UN the idea of sovereign equality of all of its members. Yet this principle at the UN violates when it singles out and punishes Israel absolutely disproportionately to all other nations on earth. U.S. policy has long maintained that direct bilateral negotiations are the only path to peace in the Arab-Israeli conflict. When we consider that this is our government's official policy, we are forced to recognize the UN as its primary opponent, Because of the reckless agenda of the Palestinian Authority and the misguided policies of global elites in New York and Geneva, the UN increasingly serves as a platform for efforts to circumvent negotiations, impose conditions, and isolate Israel. Palestinian officials manipulate UN institutions to create a parallel reality in which Palestine is a recognized state. The green line is the international border, and Jewish and Christian heritage in the Holy Land does not exist. The Palestinian Authority has proven to be more interested in scoring Pyrrhic victories at the UN, whether through having its flag in front of the UN headquarters or gaining full UNESCO membership, than in putting in the hard work to achieve true statehood with its Israeli negotiation partner. It is clear from many UN decisions that a growing number of states and institutions prefer to construct an alternative universe rather than build sustainable peace. In one especially unconscionable example, UNESCO in October voted to approve 2 resolutions that erased every single reference to Judaism and Christianity from the ancient holy sites of Jerusalem's Old City. And as we are all aware, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2334, papering over decades of agreements concerning the 1949 armistice line and essentially declaring it to be Israel's established border with the Palestinian territories. The ever-growing list of anti-Israeli resolutions, reports, and screeds at the UN are not only wrong and counterproductive, they are also absurd. In a world of oppressive dictators, international menaces, and systemic human rights abuses, UN institutions repeatedly cast Israel, the Middle East's only liberal democracy, as a pariah state. The UN General Assembly in September issued 20 anti-Israeli resolutions, more than the total number of resolutions on Syria, Iran, North Korea combined. Equally astonishing, the General Assembly did not pass a single resolution addressing human rights abuses in China, and I chair the China Commission, and I can tell you, we put out our report last year. Xi Jinping, the dictator in China, is in a race to the bottom with North Korea, and nary a word, not a word, against China for its egregious violations of human rights. Same goes for Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Again, where's the General Assembly when it comes to those nations? Clearly, the UN is an institution that is in need of reform. And now, this subcommittee, in conjunction with our good friend, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, in the last Congress held hearings on corruption at the World Intellectual Property Organization, where its Director General retaliated against whistleblowers who uncovered illicit transactions with rogue states of North Korea and Iran. We have also examined, and I've had 5 hearings on this, the UN peacekeepers being part of trafficking and raping little girls. They talk about zero tolerance, and at one of the hearings we called it zero compliance with the order telling them to cease and desist such egregious behavior. Sadly, we even have indications that the FAO has sought to silence truth-tellers within that organization while offering a plush diplomatic post to shield a former First Lady who was under investigation in her own country for receiving bribes in a corruption scandal that touched certain Latin American countries. And UNRWA, both Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and I have held hearings about how UNRWA systematically promotes anti-Semitism. We are the leading donor to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees. I'm glad we are, but the textbooks and all of the other anti-Semitic activity that occurs there has to stop. $359 million is just far too much without getting a commensurate tolerance policy out of that organization. Again, thank you, Madam Chair, and
Thank you very
look forward
much
to our testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And now so pleased to recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, Karen Bass of California.
Well, let me thank our chairs, Ros-Lehtinen and Smith, and also our ranking member Deutsch of the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee for this extremely important hearing. I'd also like to welcome the witnesses for joining us this morning and note that I look forward to hearing each of their testimonies regarding these important issues that touch on not only the role of the UN and the importance of the U.S. continuing its leadership role, but also issues of import to the Africa Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations Subcommittee. The role of the U.S. at the UN is a critical leadership role, just as the role of the U.S. on the global stage is one based on a strong legacy of leadership. In a world that has had increasingly to deal with non-state actors, terrorism, and asymmetrical warfare, the role of the UN is even more important. For example, the UN currently provides food to some 80 million people in 80 countries throughout the world. The United Nations vaccinates 40% of the world's children. The UN assists over 65 million refugees and people fleeing war, famine, or persecution. The United Nations keeps peace through 120,000 peacekeepers, the largest deployed military in the world. And the UN promotes maternal health, saving the lives of 30 million women. And throughout this process, the role of the U.S. is invaluable. Are there issues of reform that must and should continue to take place? The answer is yes, and our voice, the voice of the U.S., has been foremost in this regard. One shining example of such reform can be found at one of the most important of UN agencies. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees is currently facing one of the largest human displacement crises on record. Primarily, the agency promotes life-saving assistance and protection, including shelter, food, clean water, education, and medical care to nearly 47 million people worldwide who have been forced to flee their homes. UNHCR also works to prevent gender-based violence and works to build self-sufficiency in the refugee and displaced persons population by way of capacity training, and helps these populations rebuild their lives with the goal of enabling them to resettle. In 2006, under the able leadership of the then UN Commission of Refugees, Antonio Guterres, the former Prime Minister of Portugal, UNHCR addressed hard questions regarding its cost and its efficiencies. Many of these questions were posed by the U.S. Reports state that at the outset of the reform process, the total volume of UNHCR's activities was in U.S. currency, $1.1 billion. And by the end of 2015, total savings was effectively tripled, reaching $3.3 billion, thanks to cost-saving reforms. The reforms implemented by then UN High Commissioner for Refugees enabled the agency to reduce considerably costs pertaining to its headquarters and staff by partnering with non-governmental organizations. Also, by reducing staff, UNHCR was able to expand its operations in the field, improve delivery, and respond more effectively to unprecedented demands for its assistance worldwide, including Syria, Iraq, Yemen, South Sudan, Ukraine, Central African Republic, and several other countries. Antonio Guterres is now the Secretary General of the UN and a proven leader regarding reform. The new Secretary General expressed his commitment to working with the administration and Congress to ensure continued engagement by the U.S. Despite this, there remain many in Congress seeking to withhold our UN assessment or extract the U.S. from the international body altogether, which would devastate many priorities. Defunding the UN could have significant implications for the safety of Americans and U.S. interests worldwide. I would like to hear from the witnesses on these implications and, for example, what this means regarding U.S.-led multilateral sanctions against terrorists, and what the impact would be for Israel if the U.S. were to reduce its participation or to leave the UN. Let me close by noting that the U.S. has an ongoing leadership role to play at the UN. We have the proverbial seat at the table as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. The United Nations is better because of our presence, our participation, and our leadership. Friends of the U.S. on every continent know that they can count on this country's role in the UN. Do we always agree with our friends? No. Do our friends always agree with us? No. But the fact that the United States participates actively and calls robustly for reform is pertinent. It is a clarion call that must continue and a role we must play and continue to encourage other UN members to address. It would be unwise and frankly dangerous to consider doing otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bass. Now we will turn to our members for their opening statements. This is the list that I have. If anyone would like to be added, please let us know. Mr. DeSantis, followed by Cicilline, Kinzinger, Zeldin, Wagner, and Shabbat. Mr. DeSantis of Florida.
Thank you. The UN has really become a forum for anti-Israel activism and ganging up, in effect, on the world's only Jewish state. Now, we did a resolution here in the Congress to disapprove of the deplorable UN Resolution 2334, but that resolution didn't really do anything. There was no teeth to the resolution. So I do think we need to respond here in the Congress by removing funding for the UN unless and until they get right with this and repeal the resolution. And so I have a lot of problems with how UN has treated Israel. But I also think we need to work with our allies and let our allies know that joining these anti-Israel efforts in the UN or other international organizations, that's just going to harm their relationship with us here in the United States. And so we need some of our close allies to get better on this issue. I think this rewarded Palestinian Arab bad behavior. We in the Congress absolutely need to look at removing funding going over to the Palestinian Authority, given that that frees up money for them to, even to this day, pay pensions for the families of suicide bombers and terrorists. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. DeSantis. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Chairman Smith and Ranking Members Deutsch and Bass for calling this hearing today. There is no question that the United Nations has continually placed an unfair and biased lens on Israel. I believe the UN has been a vital stabilizing force at the various bodies of the UN, including the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council. And the U.S. role in each of those bodies is critical. The UN is an imperfect body made up of imperfect nation-state members governed by imperfect people. But I implore my colleagues to remember why the UN was created. Born out of the ashes of the greatest conflict this world has ever known, the UN is designed to temper tensions and provide an avenue for conflict resolution, among many other things. To threaten to pull out or severely limit U.S. participation in the UN, as President Trump has suggested, is extremely reckless. A thoughtful discussion on ways to improve the UN and make U.S. participation even more impactful would be very welcome. But a knee-jerk reaction that takes us out of the game entirely would be extremely harmful to U.S. national interests and to American leadership in the world. I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses and welcome you to today's hearing. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's good to be back on your committee. We all know how dismayed we were at the abstention. I think that's not going to happen again in this new administration. But I support the UN. I think, for instance, I've seen their actions in Liberia. That's missions that you would not see U.S. troops doing, and it's a very good force multiplier. And I agree with my friends on the other side of the aisle. We can't leave. We need a seat at the table. But I think it's time that the table gets turned over a little bit. Russians are bombing UN aid convoys. You have a genocide in Syria with 50,000 dead children and a butcher Assad existing. And this is the type of stuff the UN spends its time on. So I think it's obvious that there needs to be some serious reform. I think the only way to reform that is the U.S. at the table. But I think it's time for the U.S. to exert that strong leadership, and I'm excited to be here and part of that conversation. I yield back.
So are we. Thank you so much. Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I wanted to just weigh in support of a few positions I feel very strongly about. One, that the United States should have never let that UN Security Council resolution to pass. The irony that it was passed the day before Hanukkah, and yet just before that there was a White House menorah lighting ceremony to celebrate the Maccabees' fight for freedom on a land that they lived, fought, prayed for. Judea and Samaria, land that this resolution says is an illegal occupation. I agree with Mr. DeSantis that our funding should be removed from the United Nations until this UN Security Council resolution is reversed. The United Nations is becoming a force for exactly what it was created to fight against. We should not be providing aid to the Palestinian Authority while they are funding terror, rewarding people murdering innocent Israelis and Americans in the case, for example, like Taylor Force. We need to have both sides recognizing each other's right to exist, tackle the BDS movement, move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, stand with our nation's greatest ally. I yield back.
Thank you very much, sir. Ms. Wagner is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I must first just say I'm thrilled to be a new member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and certainly on this subcommittee. And I thank the chairman for organizing an excellent hearing and thank our witnesses for being here today. Given the Obama administration's secret support for Security Council Resolution 2334 and silent release of $221 million to the Palestinian Authority, not to mention the administration's horrific $400 million ransom payment to Iran last year, it is nice to be able to once again discuss U.S. relations with Israel, I'll say in the light of day, instead of in the shadows and after the fact. As a former United States ambassador, I believe deeply in the power of the American leadership at the international bargaining table. And I'm excited to learn today how under a new administration our country can start acting like a leader by confronting instead of acquiescing to the UN's radical bias against Israel. I thank you and I yield back.
I thank you, Ms. Wagner. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for calling this very important hearing, and I want to apologize ahead of time. We have a markup in judiciary that I'm going to have to run through, but I just wanted to say quickly, even though he's the minority witness, I wanted to welcome and thank Congressman Wexler for being here today. We happen to serve on both the Judiciary and the Foreign Affairs Committee together, and in Judiciary we got to be on opposite sides of William Jefferson Clinton's impeachment. But on this committee, we generally agreed, and we went all the way to The Hague together, 2 members of Congress, bipartisan, to defend the hostile actions from much of the world against Israel when they were building the wall or the barrier or whatever, fencing, whatever you want to call it, to protect Israel's citizens from an onslaught. I believe it was during the Second Intifada, if I'm not mistaken. And we made the point there that it was not Israel that should be condemned by the UN or the world or anybody else. It's those people who raise their children to aspire to be suicide bombers. Those are the people that should be condemned by the world, and not Israel, who is simply trying to defend itself. So even though I will not be here to hear your testimony or the other gentlemen here today, I can assure you that I will read the transcript and thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. Those are the members who had indicated that they wanted to speak, and seeing no other calls for that time, we're pleased to introduce our witness. First, we're delighted to welcome Mr. Hillel Neuer. He's the Executive Director of UN Watch, a Geneva-based NGO that monitors the UN and promotes human rights. Mr. Neuer is an expert on the UN Human Rights Council, has addressed every single one of its 33 regular sessions. We look forward to your testimony, Hillel, and we thank you for traveling so far to be with us this morning. In the interest of full transparency, I will tell you that he presented me with a coffee mug well within the ethics rules, Mr. Deutsch. And I like it that you put the criticism of your organization from UNRWA. Yes, we are known by our enemies. Congrats. And next, we would like to welcome Mr. Brian Hook, who is the founder of Latitude LLC. Prior to this, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations and as Senior Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Welcome, Mr. Hook. I would also like to welcome back to our subcommittee Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, who is the Senior Vice President of Research for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Dr. Schanzer served as a counterterrorism analyst at the Department of Treasury, and prior to that, worked as a research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome back, Jonathan. And last but not least, as Mr. Shabbat pointed out, we are so pleased to welcome back Mr. Robert Wexler, who formerly was a member of the Florida delegation to Congress, is now president of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace. During his time in Congress, Mr. Wexler was the chair of the Subcommittee on Europe and of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, served on the Middle East Subcommittee, and we miss you here in Congress so much, Mr. Wexler. We don't get to see you enough, so thank you very much for joining us. And he more or less had your seat, or Lois Frank, yours? Okay. All right, wonderful. Welcome back. And Mr. Neuer, we will begin with you. Thank you so much. And as I said, all of your statements will be made a part of the record.
Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Deutsch, Ranking Member Bass, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the important matter of the United Nations, Israel, and the Palestinians. Alarming actions by the UN have drawn renewed attention to the world body's pattern and practice of scapegoating Israel and to the vast infrastructure that the UN has constructed to demonize the Jewish state. Now, normally the one UN body that is protected from the campaign to single out Israel for discriminatory treatment is the Security Council. Normally, the United States uses its veto power in that body to deter or defeat unbalanced, unfair, and unhelpful initiatives. That is why all of us were astonished to see the Obama administration in its last days break with tradition and allow the enactment of Resolution 2334. It sent the message to the Palestinians that they have no need to negotiate, but can wait for the UN to give them everything they demand. It encourages efforts to prosecute Israeli leaders and officers at the International Criminal Court and boycott campaigns. Former Secretary of State Kerry said that the resolution condemned Palestinian terrorism and incitement. In fact, the text nowhere attributes these crimes to Palestinians. Absurdly, Jerusalem's Temple Mount and Western Wall, the holiest sites in Judaism, together with the Jewish quarter of the Old City, are all defined by 2334 as, quote, occupied Palestinian territory. Now, Congress should make clear that accusing the Jewish state of illegally occupying its holiest sites and historic capital is as absurd as saying that the Vatican is illegally occupied by the Catholic Church, that Mecca is illegally occupied by Muslims, or that London, Paris, and Washington are illegally occupied by the British, French, and Americans. If the Security Council is normally the exception, what preceded that decision in 2016 is the rule. In March, the Commission on the Status of Women condemned Israel as the world's only violator of women's rights, ignoring real abusers such as Iran and Saudi Arabia. At the same time, the Human Rights Council celebrated its 10th anniversary, a decade in which it adopted 68 resolutions against Israel and 67 on the rest of the world combined. The Council also appointed Canadian law professor Michael Link as the, quote, special rapporteur on Palestine, whose mandate actually is to investigate Israel only. While all UN monitors are obliged to be impartial, and though Mr. Link was expressly asked in his application about his objectivity, he failed to disclose his long record of anti-Israel lobbying or his board membership on 3 pro-Palestinian organizations, including Friends of Sabeel. He now has that post for the next 6 years. In May, the UN's World Health Organization singled out Israel as the only violator in the world of, quote, mental, physical, and environmental health. In September, UN expert Dubravka Simonovic, summing up her visit to the Palestinian territories, concluded that when Palestinian men beat their wives, it's Israel's fault. In October, UNESCO negated its mandate to protect world heritage by adopting a resolution which used Islamic-only terms for Jerusalem's Temple Mount, denying thousands of years of Jewish and Christian heritage, religion, and culture. In December, the General Assembly adopted 20 one-sided resolutions against Israel and only 6 on the rest of the world combined. There was not one resolution on Saudi Arabia, China, Cuba, Venezuela, Turkey, and many other serial human rights abusers. Now, as the chairman indicated, one of the worst offenders is UNRWA. This morning, UN Watch published a 130-page expose entitled Poisoning Palestinian Children, a report on UNRWA teachers' incitement to jihadist terrorism and anti-Semitism. This report documents 40 cases and is now online at unwatch.org. With your permission, I will submit the report to enter it into the record. One can see Facebook pages of UNRWA teachers celebrating the kidnapping of Israeli teenagers, cheering rockets fired at Israeli civilians, erasing Israel from the map, and posting overtly anti-Semitic videos, caricatures, and statements. Last year, we exposed 30 cases. UNRWA's response, as you read from the mug, was to attack UN Watch and to deny the problem. We know of not one racist teacher who was fired. In October 2015, the UK banned a teacher for life from the classroom for a Facebook post praising Hitler. In our report, there are 2 staffers who published the identical Hitler photo and comment, and I want to know, why are UK children protected from racist teachers while Palestinian children are left exposed to this poison? There is a new UN Secretary General, and there is a new concern about funding. He said he'd be on the front line in the battle against anti-Semitism. We've just sent him the report, and we hope that indeed he will be on the front lines. The U.S. Congress is the one reliable force that can hold the UN to account. I thank you for your continued noble efforts. There is more in my written remarks about which I would be happy to elaborate.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Hook is recognized.
Ranking Member Deutsch. I thank the committee for giving its attention to reforming the United Nations and ensuring the fair treatment of Israel at the UN. My testimony will draw from personal experience serving as a senior advisor to the U.S. ambassador to the UN for 2 years and also serving as Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations. I think that by working in mutually supportive roles, the Congress and the Trump administration have a very good opportunity to foster a more accountable and transparent United Nations to advance American interests. But the U.S.-UN relationship will never be fully successful so long as one of our closest allies is singled out unfairly at the UN. I think this committee knows very well that Israel faces an almost robotic hostility at the United Nations over many decades. And the last year was particularly disappointing when we look at actions taken by the Human Rights Council on blacklists, the UNESCO resolution on the Temple Mount, 2334, and then the UN General Assembly resolutions. I want to just share my general approach on how to work effectively with the United Nations and also highlight some reforms. I think taken together, they can help advance the interests of the United States as well as Israel because our interests so often overlap at the UN. I believe as a first principle that the United States needs to maintain diplomatic flexibility, working with the UN when it advances our interests and promotes the cause of peace, and looking elsewhere when success is unlikely and would lead to failures in multilateralism. This requires making prudential judgments on a case-by-case basis. The UN Security Council can often advance our interests because it's a force multiplier. It helps our allies take action because it gives them political and legal cover back home. And it can also help us diplomatically isolate our opponents. But we can never allow the UN Security Council to hold our security concerns hostage. Nor should we encourage or allow the Council to opine or vote on matters that are properly between Israel and the Palestinians. The UN Security Council remains the single worst forum in the world to facilitate peace in the Middle East. I think instead the Council should shift action. We should be always working to shift action away from the Council and toward direct negotiations. And I do believe that we should put serious diplomatic support behind Israel's candidacy for a non-permanent seat, and we should ask the Europeans to support it as part of our bilateral agenda with our European allies. With regard to the UN Human Rights Council, my own view is that formal participation by the United States in this body legitimizes it without sufficiently advancing human rights. A top item on the Bush administration list when I served at the UN was abolishing the UN Human Rights Commission. And we fought for the necessary reforms. But pressure within the UN system to reach multilateral consensus caused our proposals to get watered down repeatedly. And we ended up voting no against the resolution that created the Human Rights Council. So the very advocates for the reform in the first place decided to vote against it. Our dissent at the time was joined by only 3 countries, and Israel was one of them. At the time, we were attacked for standing in the way of reform, and we were mocked during the vote for being so isolated. But time has vindicated our decision. The Council has behaved entirely as we predicted it would in 2006 when we were in the General Assembly. It remains biased against Israel. It includes repressive governments among its members, and it fails to condemn many of the world's worst human rights abusers. And so I favor withdrawing from the Human Rights Council until it adopts the reforms necessary to be a body worthy of its name. But I think that any decision should be taken in consultation with our allies, especially Israel, who would face an even more hostile body without the United States as a formal member. UNESCO's approval on Palestine as a member, I think I agree with earlier statements. I think that we should maintain a clear policy of refusing to pay pay dues to any institution that accepts Palestine as a state before an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal is reached. In closing, President Truman saw the United Nations as part of, quote, a chain of defense to protect this beloved country of ours. And in 1952, he said that if we keep working at it, the UN will become what it was intended to be. Almost 70 years later, people are understandably questioning whether the UN will ever live up to the intentions of its founding nations. But I know from personal experience that international organizations can concretely advance American interests when used rightly, when multilateralism is understood as a means to an end and not an end in itself. I'm happy to take questions after our statements, and I again thank the committee for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. Dr. Schanzer.
Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Deutsch, Ranking Member Bass, and distinguished members, thank you for the opportunity to testify. Well, U.S.-Israel ties remain strong thanks to the role of Congress. Recent years have witnessed some low points in the bilateral relationship, from tensions over the deeply flawed Iran deal to the shameful abstention on UN Security Council Resolution 2334. The Obama White House broke dramatically from longstanding U.S. policies. The new administration has indicated that it wants to restore ties to previously warm levels, and among other things, it seeks to address the anti-Israel bias at the UN. Here are 4 of my recommendations to get things started. First, we need to reform the UN 1267 Committee. This is the UN's terrorism sanctions list. Currently, it only includes al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the Islamic State. Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups are not included. This list needs to reflect the full range of threats to the U.S. and its allies. Second, we must reform and ultimately phase out UNRWA, which is the UN's agency that supports Palestinian refugees. Today, there are 30,000 to 50,000 surviving members from the original wars of 1948 and 1967, but because UNRWA counts the offspring of the original refugees, the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, that number is now counted as 5 million. In other words, UNRWA is making more refugees rather than settling them. Meanwhile, the agency stands accused of cooperating with Hamas. UNRWA must be brought to account. Third, we should eradicate the UN Human Rights Council. It is simply Orwellian. Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, and other states that engage in war crimes and massive human rights violations lambast Israel while failing to be held to account. In March, as noted, the Council voted to create a blacklist of companies that work in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. These are companies that foster cooperation between Palestinians and Israelis. Congress and the administration should spike the blacklist and work to end the tenure of this grotesque body. Fourth, it's time to examine the UN's interim force in Lebanon. Under Security Council Resolution 1701, UNIFIL was tasked to ensure that Hezbollah did not rearm, but Hezbollah now has some 150,000 rockets furnished by Iran. The administration and Congress should determine whether UNIFIL is worthy of reauthorization. I suspect it is not. But reforming the UN alone is insufficient. Congress and the administration should review U.S. ties with the PLO. Congress has long expressed concern that the PLO pays the salaries of terrorists in Israeli jails and fans the flames of incitement. And there are other issues, too. For example, FDD received unconfirmed reports in November from the West Bank that the U.S. and the PLO possibly coordinated ahead of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas's September 22nd speech at the United Nations. Indeed, the United States may have even helped transfer funds to the PLO institutions to help Abbas promote his policies. I think Congress might want to investigate this. Congress may also wish to investigate the PLO's possible role in the boycott campaign against Israel, which runs counter to U.S. policy. We received reports that the PNF, the Palestine National Fund, the PLO's treasury, may be active in this area. We also received reports that the PLO mission in Belgium may be running a, quote, operations room, end quote, for European BDS activities. The PLO embassy in Washington may also be involved in coordinating U.S.-based BDS activities as well. Then there is the PLO leadership crisis. While Abbas is rightly touted as being committed to nonviolence, this is not the same as being a proponent of peace. As PLO chief, he has for years refused to negotiate in good faith. 12 years into Abbas's 4-year term, with no successor in sight, time is running out to identify new leadership committed to good governance and peaceful coexistence with Israel. Before I conclude, I want to suggest 3 other steps that Congress might consider to strengthen U.S.-Israel ties. For one, the Trump administration reportedly seeks to negotiate several new trade agreements. This presents new opportunities to include clauses that discourage boycotts against U.S. allies, including Israel. Congress can also consider changing the anti-boycott provisions of the Export Administration Act. These provisions were originally designed to combat the Arab League boycott. They can now be updated to target broader boycott activity. The Commerce Department could then be empowered to fend off economic warfare campaigns against the U.S., Israel, and other allies. Finally, Congress might consider updating the Export Administration regulations that upgrade Israel to Tier 1 rather than Tier 2 as part of the Strategic Trade Authorization. This would allow Israel to quickly procure key military components during periods of conflict. It would enhance Israel's qualitative military edge and our strategic cooperation at the same time. Madam Chairman, Mr. Chairman, I cover more in my written testimony, but in the interest of time, I'll end here. On behalf of FDD, thank you for inviting me today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. And now, Mr. Wexler.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for your 27 years of service to Florida and to the nation. Thank you, Chairman Smith, Ranking Members Deutsch and Bass, members of the subcommittee. It is undeniable that the United Nations has demonstrated a systematic obsession with unjust criticism of Israel and an institutional anti-Israel bias for decades. During its 2015-16 session, the UN General Assembly passed 20 resolutions targeting Israel, more than all other countries combined. The damaging legacy of GA Resolution 3379, Zionism is Racism, passed in 1975 and rescinded in 1991, is a network of well-funded UN structures committed to the delegitimization of Israel and boycott, divestment, and sanction efforts. The Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People is the UN structure most responsible for the political, economic, and diplomatic assault against Israel. Also, Standing Item 7 of the Human Rights Council irrationally discriminates against Israel and is a poorly disguised mechanism to discredit the Jewish state. The historically unfounded collective efforts of UNRWA and UNESCO denying the Jewish character of Israel contribute to Palestinian obstinance and encourage their unrealistic demand for a full right of return. Congress and the administration should work with Secretary General Guterres, who just this week clearly documented the Jewish connection to the land of Israel, to dismantle the anti-Israel UN infrastructure and repeal Item 7 or lead boycotts against it. Defunding UNRWA would be counterproductive because Israel and Jordan would bear the additional burden. For the benefit of Israel, Palestinians, and UN credibility, Congress should exercise its leverage to reform the problematic UN infrastructure, reflecting a renewed international commitment to a negotiated two-state outcome focused on building Palestinian institutions and economic growth. Any successful strategy must take into account promising regional developments. Prime Minister Netanyahu has long maintained that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict results from competing historical narratives. Israeli Defense Minister Lieberman advocates for a regional approach to peacemaking. Both men are correct, and the positive responses of the Sunni Arab states to former Secretary of State Kerry's final address on Middle East peace demonstrate the new regional dynamic. Paramount among Kerry's 6 principles was the vision of GA Resolution 181, calling for the establishment of 2 states for 2 peoples, 1 Jewish, 1 Arab, with mutual recognition and equal rights for all citizens. The positive reaction to the principle of 2 states for 2 peoples by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, Turkey, among others, opens the door to the reconciliation of the competing historical narratives that Prime Minister Netanyahu speaks of. I just visited Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Mikhail Bogdanov and others in Moscow. We share certain common objectives with Russia on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, as we do our European allies. In fact, if reformed, the UN committees and the Middle East Quartet can be instrumental in helping the Israelis and Palestinians forge an international consensus based on a regional strategy that ends the conflict, guarantees a Jewish majority, democratic state of Israel that is secure, and implements the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people in their own state. By genuinely promoting a negotiated two-state outcome, the UN would further isolate Iran and Israel's enemies that reject Israel's right to exist. The Obama administration's recent abstention on Resolution 2334 was, in my view, a clumsy attempt to restate America's longstanding bipartisan policy of opposing unilateral steps by any party, including settlement building east of the 1967 lines. Please, though, we should not practice selective memory. Every U.S. administration since 1967 has at times abstained from or cast votes critical of Israeli policy at the UN. President Johnson, 7 votes. Nixon, 15, 4, 2. Carter, 14. Reagan, 21. H.W. Bush, 9. Clinton, 3. W. Bush, 6. Obama, 1. The biggest problem with the resolution is that it failed to distinguish between those settlements that are adjacent to the 1967 lines and are consistent with the negotiated two-state outcome, and those settlements that are outlying and therefore undermine a two-state solution. President Trump recently referred to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as the ultimate deal. His characterization is correct. Without a resolution, however, the Zionist dream is endangered, and Israel will likely end up a binational state, half Jewish, half Arab. Don't let that happen on our watch. One final thought, Madam Chairman. As President Trump rightfully formulates a tough response to Iran's latest provocation, he's likely to implement his strategy through the UN Security Council. Now is not the time to undermine President Trump's legitimate efforts at the UN. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wexler. And as I said, I'm just so thrilled with all of our new members, so I will switch times and spots on for the speaking question and answer period with Ms. Wagner. So I will turn to her first.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for the indulgence, and I thank you all for joining us today. As a representative of the 2nd District of Missouri, I'm proud of the many refugees we have welcomed in from across our world. One example in my district are the many wonderful Bosnian refugees who have learned English, started small businesses, and integrated into the St. Louis region. Many of these men and women and their children and grandchildren have become true leaders in our community. However, it is well understood that the descendants of these refugees, albeit having unique experiences and histories, are American citizens, not refugees. The UN would agree. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East would inexplicably not agree. Moreover, the United States Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, has exacerbated extremism in the region by conducting parliamentary training in UNRWA schools, hiring employees affiliated with Hamas in defiance of UN and U.S. rule, and enabling weapons to be stored in UNRWA facilities. Mr. Schanzer, in your opinion, does the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East serve purposes that the Palestinian Authority, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and other UN offices could not serve?
Thank you, Congresswoman Wagner. Look, it's a terrific question, and I think one that we've been struggling with for quite some time. UNRWA is the only agency that is dedicated to a specific refugee population. Every other one is handled through the High Commission on Refugees. And so it makes very little sense that UNRWA would continue to exist with this one purpose. I see no reason why the High Commission couldn't handle the same refugee problem. And this is, in effect, what I would recommend, that over time we want to phase this out. There is, I think, one caveat, and that is that there are destitute Palestinians that rely on this assistance, and that if you took that assistance away, that you could see pandemonium break loose within the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and perhaps other Palestinian refugee camps. So you want to make sure that the services continue, but that the political aspects of UNRWA are removed, and that ultimately the treatment of refugees themselves, currently numbering somewhere between 30 to 50,000 by best estimates.
The political aspects, along with a number of these conducts.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, obviously, in terms of its working with Hamas. Now, of course, if you're going to work in the Gaza Strip, you probably can't help but to work with Hamas, but storing weapons underneath facilities is something that cannot go unaddressed.
Thank you. Mr. Neuer, can you please discuss how the United States should condition its funding to ensure that U.S. dollars are not contributing to an agency that is exacerbating tensions in the region and undermining Israel-Palestine prospects for peace?
I think you're touching on a very important point. There's no question that the United Nations at this moment is deeply concerned about its funding and is very attentive to the concerns of its donor states, the foremost for UNRWA, of which is the United States. I think the first thing that the United States needs to do is to demand accountability in a serious way. And I'm not sure in the past 2 years when we issued comparable reports to the one that we released today, I'm not sure that we saw the U.S. demanding real accountability. We did not see any public statements from Ambassador Samantha Power, regrettably, criticizing UNRWA. On the contrary, there were public statements that always praised UNRWA. So I think the first thing we need to see is to test accountability by making serious demands, and that's why this morning we've written to Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and to Ambassador Nikki Haley to urge them to demand from the UN Secretary General and from UNRWA that they clearly condemn incitement to terrorism and anti-Semitism, which is rampant in the organization.
Thank you, Mr. Neuer. And also, if you could briefly, here in my limited time, discuss options for institutional reform that would ensure the UNRWA is not a vehicle for Palestinian resentment and actions against Israel.
Well, I think one of the problems...
And perhaps you're on the road to that right now with the letters that you've currently...
Thank you, yes. Well, I think one of the problems is that when one releases information like this, the response of some UNRWA donors is to say, well, we've deleted the Facebook page and the problem is solved. Well, you know, the core problem of UNRWA, as I mentioned in my written remarks, is the narrative of UNRWA, which really undermines the existence of the State of Israel with the 5 million so-called refugees. But beyond that, the fact that there are teachers, at least 20 teachers today, who post pictures of Hitler and celebrate terrorist attacks, the problem isn't that they have a Facebook post. The problem is why are pro-Hitler teachers standing before students?
Absolutely.
And that's what we need to see.
Thank you. I appreciate for the indulgence of your time. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wagner. Excellent questions. And now I'll turn to my co-chair, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Congressman Wexler, let me just start by saying, though you served your constituents well, I do not wish that you were here, at least not serving in the seat that you held so admirably for so many years. But I do want to ask you a couple of questions. I guess the first question is, what should the United States do to ensure that the two-state solution, which is ultimately the goal, certainly the stated goal of the Israeli Prime Minister, what should the U.S. do to ensure that a two-state solution remains viable?
Thank you. There are a number of things that we can do, and there are a number of things we should not do. First off, we should not impose solutions. That's not the role of the United States in terms of a friend and an ally. Israel is a democratic state, and it should protect her own interests. But what we can do, number one, is recognize that there are two sides to this equation, or even more than that. There are Israeli responsibilities, there are Palestinian responsibilities, there are responsibilities of the larger Arab world. And we need to encourage a dynamic that promotes a legitimate discussion, negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. To the point of this hearing, in specifically, and the criticism that has been voiced of the resolution before the United Nations, much of which I agree with, but let's be candid about it. Yeah, the terminology of the resolution has its tremendous flaws, as was pointed out. But there were certain actions taken by both the Palestinians, which should be condemned, but also the most recent Israeli government, which set in motion a set of circumstances that were far more dire than an Israeli government had done before. For instance, just this week now, the Israeli Knesset is considering a legalization bill that will set in process a troubling trend of outlying settlements being legalized in contrary to Israeli law and international law. The Attorney General of Israel appointed, ironically, compared to our own situation this week, the Attorney General of Israel, appointed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, has concluded that he will not enforce the legalization bill that is likely to be passed by the Knesset because it violates Israeli law and international law. This was the dynamic in which President Obama made the decision that he made. Now, I'm not justifying the decision, but if we want to at least analyze it from a full perspective, understand there are two sides. But to the question of settlements, if I may, what we should encourage the Israeli government to do, Congressman Shabbat referenced that he and I went to The Hague to argue on behalf of Israel's right to build the security fence, and thankfully they did in response to the intifada, the last terrible intifada that occurred. Well, now you have an Israeli-created border in effect. Inside that border, in my humble opinion, President Trump should say to Israel, go ahead, build what you want, because those settlements, by and large, are consistent with a negotiated two-state outcome. But outside of that wall Israel created, don't build. The announcements this week that Israel created, most of it was within the wall, but a lot of it was outside of it. Don't do that. And what Israel should also say to the world, not withdraw its forces from the West Bank and create a security vacuum, but what it should announce to the world and its people is that they don't have any sovereignty claims beyond the security fence that they built for their own defense. If they do that, their degree of moral credibility and the degree of credibility they would have in terms of the totality of their policies would enhance their friends here in Washington. And the last thing we should do is get out of the UN or reduce our role or reduce our funding, because that'll dramatically impact Israel in a negative way.
Thank you. Dr. Shanger, I don't have a lot of time left, but you had suggested that, that the United States helped the PLO transfer funds to promote Abbas's policies to help him lobby. I'm not sure that I understand what that means. Were these taxpayer dollars? What are you suggesting happened here?
Well, Congressman Deutsch, thank you for the question. We received two reports from the West Bank earlier this year, right around Abbas's speech on September 22nd, that funds may have been transferred to PLO institutions ahead of this. What they were used for is entirely unclear. The implication is that it somehow served to benefit the PLO. I have these two reports. I've got nothing that I've seen beyond that. It hasn't appeared in Arabic, Hebrew, or English, other than from these two reports coming from the West Bank. I raise it because, of course, we now know of the transfer of funds that happened at the 11th hour of the Obama administration as the president was on his way out. It certainly struck me as curious, to say the least.
Well,
and
I'm out of time, but just on that one, there's some. I hope that others will ask, because I'm still not sure. There's two reports that there were some transfers of some money. It's a rather explosive charge you're making, and so I hope we'll have a chance to talk more about that. And with respect to the $220 million, I hope, and I hope we can benefit from the insight of our witnesses, but it's my understanding that as a result of a 2014 policy change that those dollars don't go to the PA, that they go toward paying Israeli creditors for electricity and medical services and humanitarian programs. And there's been a lot of focus on that $220 million, and I hope over the balance of this hearing we'll have a chance to understand whether that was a payment that went in the dark of night into a PA slush fund, which some have suggested, or whether there was money that, pursuant to policy changes during the last administration, went to Israeli creditors and humanitarian organizations. I just hope we'll be able to get into that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. And now we'll turn to the chairman of the Africa Subcommittee and all of those other titles.
Thank you
Mr.
very much,
Smith.
Madam Chair. Thank you all for your great testimonies. Very enlightening and very, very powerful. Let me, on the Human Rights Council, in the 1980s, I joined Armando Valladares, who spent 14 years in Castro's gulags, was tortured. I've read his book twice, Torture for Christ, Against All Hope. It was an amazing chronicling of what Cuban gulags were all about. Well, Reagan named him, as you'll recall, as our ambassador to the Human Rights Commission. He did a magnificent job. I was with him for the better part of a week in Geneva, and he alone persuaded people, with a lot of backing of the Reagan administration, to do a resolution on Cuba. And UN investigators went to the prisons, interviewed, with a ironclad promise that nobody would be retaliated against, including their family members. When they left, everybody was retaliated against. Longer prison sentences, more torture, and their family members were harassed and worse. The commission backed off, defaulted right back to agenda item number 8, and continued its singular focus on Israel. A decade ago, we were all hopeful that UN reform council standing up, and I was in Geneva and in New York on many occasions arguing for a credible UN Human Rights Council. And unfortunately, that has evaporated, and we now have agenda item 7, which is a distinction with very little difference to agenda item number 8. So my question, and as you pointed out, Mr. Noor, and I joined you, and I was working hard, got nowhere. The fact that China, Cuba, and Saudi Arabia are back on as members in good standing on what should be an organization walking point on human rights absolutely undermines the credibility of the Council. And again, when they, as Sharansky said, applies the double standard, the demonization and delegitimization of Israel so systematically, it's time for real reform, and my hope is that that will be something that is forthcoming. So, because right now the UN Council, Human Rights Council, lacks credibility. Everyone should know it. As I said before, I chair the China Commission. I was in China last year raising human rights. Xi Jinping, like Hu Jintao before him, is in a race to the bottom with North Korea on human rights, and nary a ill word or is said against China. Secondly, Resolution 2334 calls upon states to distinguish between the territory of the State of Israel and occupied territories. To me, this is ripped directly from the playbook of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that seeks to isolate Israel and undermine the vitality of its economy. This hateful campaign has made common cause with anti-Semitic forces and seeks to delegitimize Israel. It is focused in particular on undercutting the legitimacy of all Israeli settlements, including the vast majority established by private initiatives and in compliance with Israeli law. My question to the panel, Mr. Noor, you might want to start, and we may run out of time. What are the ideological underpinnings of the BDS movement, and has this new resolution further harmed efforts to combat that anti-Semitic movement?
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I do need to note that you mentioned Cuba, which has been ignored by the Council and instead is now one of its judges. I'm happy to announce that the Cuban human rights hero, Danilo Maldonado, the artist El Sexto, who's just been released from prison thanks to your efforts, will be coming in a few weeks to our Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. We're thrilled about that, as will another dozen human rights heroes from China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, North Korea, Venezuela, many of the countries that sit on the Human Rights Council that have immunity there. We will be bringing their victims to testify inside the UN. In regard to your question about the boycott efforts, I fear that Resolution 2334 gives currency and urgency to existing efforts at the International Criminal Court to continue with its preliminary examination of so-called Israeli war crimes, and that it will also encourage the so-called blacklist, the database that the Human Rights Council has ordered against companies doing business with Israeli Jewish communities over the Green Line. I think there is reason to believe that the resolution encourages all of those dangerous efforts. Thank you.
If this new administration and this Congress were to identify one red line so it's clear to the UN in terms of where America will not go beyond, I would make it any policy that the UN advances that encourages and assists BDS movements will jeopardize its standing with the United States. Make it as clear as day. And with that, I think you will find you will get not just Republican support, quite frankly, you'll get bipartisan support, because the BDS movement at its core is anti-Semitic, as you rightfully point out. But it should be coupled respectfully with efforts that are not just punitive but positive, that are aiming towards a negotiated two-state outcome. For instance, on refugees and UNRWA. Don't just cancel UNRWA's money. Don't just threaten UNRWA, even though they deserve it. Why don't we try a strategy that transfers, particularly in Area A, where the Palestinians control everything in theory, except for the ultimate security, where the Palestinians control the area, where there are refugee camps that are controlled and implemented by UNRWA, begin to transfer them over to the Palestinian Authority. Not as a penalty, transfer the money to the Palestinian Authority, but for the purpose of building Palestinian institutions, so that Palestinian institutions learn to take care of their own people, and at the same time it begins to end this disastrous ideology that the Palestinians have, that they're all going to return to the state of Israel someday and have the whole lot of the land. That's not going to happen. So I would argue, put out the red lines, but also consistent with American policy, provide the incentive for behavior that advances a negotiated two-state outcome and responsible Palestinian Authority behavior, governing its own people.
I would ask the House consent to two submissions be made a part of the record, Madam Chair.
Without objection, Michelle. Thank you. And now turn to Ms. Bass, the ranking member.
Thank you. Wanted to ask a question related to the U.S. engagement at the UN to Representative Wexler. The New York Times reported last week that the Trump administration was preparing an executive order to condition U.S. funding to multilateral organizations and for treaty implementation if it didn't meet certain criteria. So this would include those organizations that give full membership to the PA or the PLO, or any activity that circumvents sanctions against Iran and North Korea. Since then, the administration seems to have walked back the executive order. So I wanted to ask you what you think the risk and opportunities to conditioning funding like this, and can you provide examples of ways that conditions on funding might have worked in the past?
I can provide examples where we had unintended consequences, where we withdrew or limited funding, particularly on the context of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. It wasn't too long ago that the Palestinian Prime Minister was Prime Minister Fayyad, who I think all of us would agree, in the context of Palestinian politics, was the most pro-American, most transparent, most pro-peace Palestinian official that we have had. And what happened was there was a whole host of problems in the Palestinian sector, and we withdrew and limited funding to the Palestinian Authority at a certain section of time. And what was the result? The result wasn't that Hamas was curtailed in its activity. The result wasn't that the violent ones within the PA were somehow marginalized. The result was there was an economic crisis in the West Bank, and Fayyad paid the price. And Fayyad, the one guy who we really could count on for being transparent and playing by Western rules, was marginalized and then thrown out. So the Trump administration was wise to bring back its language, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't employ very surgical, tactical maneuvers that condition our participation. That's fine. But threatening over and over in a way without providing a positive incentive has shown in the past not to work.
As part of the assessed contributions to the UN regular budget, the U.S. contributes up to 22%. And kind of going along the same vein, do you think it's feasible for the U.S. to lower the requirement without compromising the UN's ability to execute operations that are of paramount interest to U.S. security?
I think we should work with the new Secretary General to make the overall UN budgets far more efficient, which he has already done in his previous role, where my understanding is UN peacekeeping operations have become significantly more efficient in terms of the costs that are expended per peacekeeper. He has diminished costs of employment. He's even, my understanding is, moved big sectors of employment from high rent districts to lesser rent districts in different countries to reduce the overall costs. There are salary measures that can be taken. But I think this broad brush, America is going to reduce its percentage, is an excuse for some of our allies, but even more importantly, those that don't necessarily see the world as America does, to reduce their expenditures. The great secret about the UN is, yes, we pay a disproportionate share.
Let me actually, before my time runs out, I wanted to ask you a question, because you ended by putting our abstention in its historical context with other administrations that have abstained before. So I wanted to know your opinion is what was so different about this time, because it was really built as though it was almost the first time the U.S. had ever even done that.
Well, what was different, in fact, was that President Obama, for 7 years and 10 months, had stood by Israel in a way that no other president ever had. Great presidents in terms of Israel that are absolutely pro-Israel presidents, President Reagan, President George W. Bush, pro-Israel presidents, didn't vote with Israel on several occasions. President Reagan condemned Israel's attack on the Iraqi nuclear facility. Thank goodness the Israelis did that. But was there an effort in this Congress, respectfully at the time, to defund the UN because President Reagan condemned the Israeli attack on the Iraqi nuclear facility? No. So this does need to be put in a historical context, but more importantly in terms of the immediate context. And again, I don't agree with the resolution and its language. It is counterproductive. And the Palestinians should be condemned and cajoled for using an international approach that won't get them the Palestinian state they deserve. But there's also behavior on the Israeli side that is not helpful. And the Israeli behavior with respect to settlements now, and the Israeli government's labor Likud, they've done settlements. But in the last several weeks, they've done it with an aggressiveness that we've not seen before. And that is not in their interests or ours.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Mr. Kinzinger of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just generally, again, I touched on it in the opening statement, but to talk about the broader UN issue, I think it's important to note that money can and should be used as leverage to reform when it's necessary. We talk a lot, about our involvement, and I think that's important to note, and we obviously have a disproportionate amount of money, and I think in that process, by the way, in having a disproportionate amount of money we put in, we also do have a disproportionate amount of influence in the organization too, which I think is something to keep in mind. But I think when there's this talk, and we've heard this in different circles for as long as I paid attention to politics, about leaving the United Nations or shutting it down or kicking it out of New York City or whatever. I think it makes good domestic politics in some areas, but I think it's very bad international politics. And so while domestically sometimes it may be tough to go home and defend why the United Nations can play an important role, when it comes to international politics, I think it's important to defend that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when you have a genocide in Syria, when you have Russian behavior reigniting a war, in essence, in eastern Ukraine, annexing Crimea, you have China, you have terrorism, and this is the effort that the UN spends their time on. you can see why people get very upset. So now is a time where the United States can use its leverage to enact change and to enact reforms. It's not going to look exactly like we want it to, because this is a world organization, not an American organization. But I think it's important to understand the good things that the UN can do and not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think we have an amazing opportunity in this process, and I hope we seize it. Mr. Hook, I have a question for you. This year, the UN Human Rights Council used one of its sessions to condemn Israel 5 times for human rights violations, but only condemned countries like Syria once. President Obama and Ambassador Rice mistakenly believed our involvement in the council would make it a more effective forum to promote and protect human rights. Given that nothing's changed since then, how can the United States effectively cut its ties from this biased, one-sided forum? Or how can we work from within the UN to ensure that any human rights forum actually does what it's supposed to do and condemns human rights violations instead of democracies?
Thanks, Congressman, for your question. I think it's much better to exercise thought leadership and present a vision of what a functioning human rights body looks like, and to hold the UN to that until it meets it. And when we participate as a formal member in the Human Rights Council, I understand that it can, at the margins, make a difference. But when this council passes 67 resolutions against Israel since 2006, and we're a member of it, we're part of it. Even when we vote against it, we're still part of it. We own some of that outcome. And so I think it would be much better for us to present a resolution in the General Assembly and to just set forth the reforms on membership criteria and other structural and membership criteria that are going to lead to a body that's worthy of its name. I think that's just the general approach. I think we should withdraw from the council. I think we should define what we think success looks like and work toward it until we have enough people supporting us.
And Mr. Schanzer, I hope I said your name right. Close enough. President Abbas is in his 12th year of his term. Obviously not getting any younger. I believe he's better than the alternative, but I remain troubled by some of the doublespeak statements and incitement of violence, and I think he's significantly hurt his credibility to make peace with Israel. Nevertheless, we don't seem to have an idea of what comes after. What do you think we can expect after Abbas?
Thank you for the question. One of my colleagues, Grant Rumley at FTD, recently concluded a report on succession. And we have a real crisis brewing. Mahmoud Abbas, again, he's been nonviolent. He stopped the Intifada back in 2005 and brought a certain amount of order to the streets of the West Bank. But at the same time, he has ensured that the younger next generation leadership has not been able to challenge him in any way. There are no elections that take place in the West Bank, at least at that level. Municipal elections can be held. But we have a real problem. There's a crisis brewing. Now, he has some challengers from the outside. Mohammed Dahlan, for example, who's in exile right now, has been trying to challenge his rule. My sense is that we are likely to see kind of a conclave of the PLO when it's time for Mahmoud Abbas to go, and they will select someone from amidst that very small inner circle. The problem is that this will likely not reflect the popular sentiment. The people will want to be able to weigh in on their leadership, and the fact that we don't have a robust debate, a robust political system, I think really is, I think it foretells a conflict that could be coming, a domestic conflict, sort of like what we've seen with the Arab Spring. So one of the things that I've been saying before this committee for several years now, and I continue to write about it, is that we need to begin to have an earnest discussion about setting up next-level leadership within the PLO if we want to have someone who continues to work with the Israelis, who can ensure a certain amount of dialogue.
Okay, and I thank you all for being here. And just to wrap up, I'll quickly say I would encourage everybody. In my prior life on foreign affairs, I remember I visited Liberia, and you see the role that the UN can play in an area like that, again, nobody else really has the capacity to do it, and leveraging countries that don't have the capacity to do it on their own, I think important to note too. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzer. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Sicily.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again to our witnesses. I'm wondering whether the panel has an assessment of what you think the likely leadership of the new UN Secretary General Guterres will be. He's made some comments regarding the Jewish connection to Jerusalem and the need for the UN to stay out of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and wondering whether you believe the Secretary General will help remove or some of the anti-Israeli bias at the UN. I mean, some of his language seems to suggest that.
I think it's obviously early on in the tenure to make that determination. I think that certainly some of the comments that we have heard from the United States about wanting to cut funds to the UN or to reform the UN, I think they're being heard. And so while, you know, I think some of the domestic discussion might seem a bit bombastic, it is resonating in Turtle Bay, it's resonating in Geneva, and I think that's important. And I think this gets to the broader point that right now we have a certain amount of leverage, right? We contribute roughly a quarter of, or whatever it is, a fifth of the UN budget. They know that we're not happy. They know there's an administration who's looking at this right now. This is the opportunity, from my perspective, to put the UN on a performance enhancement plan. In other words, to lay out over the course of a year or 2 years what sorts of reforms we would like to see and what the consequences might be if those reforms are not met. And so this, I think, is the goal, and I think we've actually started it without even having done it formally.
Mr. Wexler.
This is an incredibly important point, and I thank you for raising it. We have a new Secretary General who, yes, it is early, but he's got a record. And his record is of a reformer, a structural reformer. That's why we supported him to be Secretary General. And he reduced costs. He did the kinds of things with salaries. He did the kinds of things with peacekeeping missions that we wanted him to do, that the Western nations wanted him to do to make the place run more efficiently. Now it's time to take it to the next step, implement some of the reforms that have been identified today. But the worst thing we could do is handcuff a new Secretary General by threatening to reduce our funding and, quite frankly, completely handcuff our new ambassador to the UN. Let her make a determination on the best way to maneuver through these problems to adopt the reforms we want.
And actually, with respect to that, when the Palestinians were granted membership to UNESCO, Congress responded by cutting off U.S. funding to UNESCO. Mr. Wexler, does this kind of response discourage the Palestinians from seeking memberships in international organizations? And on the other hand, is there any evidence that it's encouraged any UN bodies or members to alter their positions or behave differently vis-a-vis Israel?
Correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is it's American law that if these agencies admit the Palestinian Authority before the Palestinians receive a state, that funding will be, American funding is taken away.
Yeah, my question is that useful? Does it change behavior?
I think it's a close call. It's a justified American position, in my humble opinion, a justified law, but as it plays out at times, it's a bit insane. I actually was on Jon Stewart's show about this issue some time ago, and they did a whole skit on how American money was taken away from these organizations, and the bottom line was we were taking money away from books, from second grade students. Now, certainly, that's not the intent of the law, and that doesn't help us, but that oftentimes is the unintended consequence. So I think there is a balancing act.
And with respect to U.S. participation on the Human Rights Council, has the number of resolutions against Israel since our arrival on that council increased over time or decreased over time? And can we draw some conclusions about the presence of the U.S. on the council?
It's dramatically decreased. And the most important point, which is a corollary to that, was when we weren't on the commission. That's when item 7 was adopted, which made the focus on Israel irrationally intense. But there is a counterpoint, and I think that's fair too, and that is even with our participation, the discrimination against Israel is way too much.
And my final question, Dr. Shanzer, you spoke about succession as it relates to kind of what happens after Abbas, and this is actually for any members of the panel. Are there things that we can do or the U.S. can do to encourage a Palestinian plan for succession that we should be doing?
Yes, we can ask for it. One of the things that we haven't done is actually engage the Palestinians on what happens after Abbas. Quite frankly, I think the U.S. policy for the last 10 years or so has been just simply to keep him in place because the alternative is Hamas. And we shouldn't forget that, of course, that Hamas can pose a significant danger to the stability of the West Bank. But at the same time, having a power vacuum can probably bring Hamas to power. Don't forget that according to basic law, Palestinian basic law, the successor to Abbas for 2 months after his death is supposed to be the Speaker of Parliament. Speaker of Parliament is a guy by the name of Aziz Dweik, and he's a member of Hamas. So you have, there's going to be a battle that takes place whenever this happens, and as we've noted, Abbas is now 12 years into a 4-year term. He's getting up there, pack-a-day smoker from what we hear. He's had a couple of serious health issues. This is really rolling the dice at this point. So I think the moment is now to engage with the Palestinians and to start to talk about who might come after and how to ensure that it's done in an orderly way.
Sure. May I quickly, this too is an incredibly important point. What we need to do, in my humble view, in terms of succession of President Abbas, is make sure that those Palestinian leaders who adhere to a policy of nonviolence, that adhere to a belief in a negotiated two-state outcome, we need to give them victories. Because when that backdoor negotiation occurs, and you have those Palestinian leaders that are not necessarily adhering to a nonviolent strategy versus the ones that do, well, when the ones that adhere to the more practical, pragmatic view have nothing to show for their policy, the more extreme view tends to win out. So we need to be proactive and make certain that over the next months and whatever the period of time is, that the pragmatic politicians and the Palestinian side get a victory or two. They need to run their 30-second commercials that say a nonviolent policy gains something.
Thank you. I yield back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Brian Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, the PLO mission in Belgium and in Washington, D.C., first, if you could describe for us how that plays into the Palestinians' strategy for diplomatic engagement. Second, if you could talk to us about any risks that may be associated with a potential move of the embassy to Jerusalem.
Sure. Thank you, Congressman Fitzpatrick. As you probably know, the PLO has missions around the world. They are not Palestinian Authority, they are PLO. And the distinction is often very difficult for people to understand, that you actually have the PA, which is a government structure that's been set up to run the daily operations of the West Bank and previously the Gaza Strip before it fell to Hamas. Then you have the PLO, which is supposed to be the sole representative of the Palestinian people in negotiations. They've also been recognized by the UN General Assembly as what's now known as the State of Palestine. And so they have this quasi-diplomatic representation around the world, and that is how they effectively lobby for their quest for statehood. The campaign is known as Palestine 194, the quest to become the 194th country at the UN. And so the PLO in Brussels, the PLO in Washington, this is what they do every day. They're also, they also happen to try to change public opinion on Israel. They try to influence public opinion on the status of possible peace talks. But really, the ultimate goal is to try to get this elevated at the Security Council to a full state, and that's what we see going on right now in Belgium and in Washington. And the assumption right now is that they're also engaging on some level in some of the pro-BDS activity, which I think is troubling. As for the move to Jerusalem, I was actually just in Israel last week speaking to some officials in Israel. I found it actually very striking that they said that a lot of the news that was circulating was not coming through Jerusalem, that it was really originating from people not close to Netanyahu's office or to the foreign ministry, so that it's either coming from people here or people who say that they're nation. My personal perspective on this is that the move would be welcomed by Israel, and I think it should be welcomed by the United States. I think it's a question of sequencing.
It's a question of engaging with our allies, speaking to the Jordanians as we just did, working with some of the Arab states, making sure that they understand exactly what is going to go on and what they might be able to get as part of a package. It's important to work with the Israelis on security to make sure that they understand what could possibly happen as a result of this move. And then there was a terrific piece by former Ambassador Shapiro in Foreign Affairs just the other day that talks about a lot of the logistics that I think we need to think about as well in terms of building the embassy, the cost, the security. There's a lot that needs to go into this, and I would personally just like to see maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months of planning for this before announcements are made.
And is it your position that Jerusalem will be safer than Tel Aviv as far as locations go?
I think that obviously it will be deemed as controversial by the Palestinians, but I think that our diplomatic security at the State Department, they know what they're doing. I'm sure at the end of the day, if they do build a new embassy, it would probably it would have to be one of the safer installations in the world, and I'm sure it would meet the specs that the diplomatic security would require.
Bradley Schneider, the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses first and foremost for the work you all do across the years, every single day, but in particular today for your insightful and informative testimony. I want to focus mostly on UNRWA, but I also want to make a quick remark or comment on the remarks you've all made about Resolution 2334, and thank you for those remarks. I think I recall my first time in Israel at the Western Wall in 1983, the holiest site to all Jews, and thinking that 17 years earlier I would not have been able to stand in that place. And to see the United Nations say that this holy site to Jews everywhere around the world is illegally occupied territory. Again, just thank you for your remarks. In Mr. Hook's remarks, you made an interesting comment that I want to expand as you talk about UNRWA, is the need to maintain flexibility. And as I think about that, there's a need or opportunities often to create flexibility. And I'll turn to you, Dr. Schanzer, first. Are there ways to create flexibility? I think your remarks about UNRWA and the need to phase it out, but the need to also make sure that you are taking care of on-the-ground requirements. How do we go to a place where that we aren't maintaining and creating refugees so many years after UNRWA was established?
Thank you, Congressman Schneider. Look, it's a complicated issue, and I can tell you that, the Israeli perspective is don't do anything too rash, right? They actually appreciate some of what UNRWA does because it takes some of the burden off of them in dealing, for example, in making sure that people are taken care of in the West Bank. I think, first of all, looking at the numbers, looking at the actual figures cited by the UN, I think it's incredibly important. When you recognize the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, et cetera, of existing refugees, it becomes a political issue and a hot-button issue. The idea that somehow Israel is saddled with the responsibility of 5 million refugees as opposed to 50,000 makes the refugee problem unsolvable. And so that is a first principle that I think must be addressed, and the fact that UNRWA was able to engage in this sort of fishy accounting in the first place is shocking to me, and the fact that we've kicked the can down the road for so many years on this is shocking to me.
If I can, and just to add, if you think about the historical creation or what moment in history established these refugees, they weren't the only refugees at the time. There were Jewish refugees at the same time, and of comparable numbers. It's time, I think, to address the issue and move forward.
That's right. And you look at, I think on top of that, I think the idea that you have a dedicated agency only to this population of refugees is also very surprising in today's day and age. There are all these huge refugee problems. We see the one in Syria, for example. And actually, UNRWA, this is a little discussed topic, but the fact that UNRWA has designated some of these Palestinians in Syria as refugees as Palestinian refugees makes their treatment more difficult as they leave Syria, as they look for help in other places. Because they can only be treated officially through UNRWA, it makes the challenges that much greater. So I think we need to address some of the political challenges associated with this, but most importantly, I think that if you're going to phase out UNRWA, and I certainly recommend over time that this be done that way, that we continue to make sure that destitute Palestinians who are in need, are still getting the services that they require. And so maybe that's through the UN itself, through the official refugee channels. Maybe it's done through the Palestinian Authority. This might be an excellent way of empowering the and in a way that might be consistent with what the Israelis are looking at. But ultimately, the perpetuation of the refugee problem is my major concern with UNRWA.
Mr. Neuer, I'll come to you in a second, Mr. Wexler. From your perspective at UN Watch in Geneva, do you see any specific pathway to addressing the issue of UNRWA and finding something to move us forward on this issue?
I think we need to see something that we haven't seen before, which is serious demands from the major donors. The UK is giving $100 million to UNRWA. The European Union is giving $130 million to UNRWA. The United States, over $350 million to UNRWA. And in recent years, we have not seen minimal demands for accountability, as I said, to demand that racist teachers who post pictures of Hitler should not be standing in front of a classroom. And as I mentioned, it's not something we would tolerate in our own school systems, and there's no reason that we deny Palestinian children the right to have racist-free education. So we need to begin by demanding accountability, and I think we could achieve reform. They are dependent on your money.
Mr. Wexler, Mr. Hook.
Do you mind if I just mention one thing on UNRWA? When it was created in 1949, it was designed to address short-term needs. And it's now 67 years later, and the United States has spent over $5 billion on this. One of the things which I think, and Brett Schaefer has talked about this at Heritage, is the need to look at this much greater competency and efficiencies in the UN High Commissioner for Refugees office. So if you look at the breakdown, the ratios, for UNRWA, for UNHCR, it's 1 staffer per 5,000 refugees. For UNRWA, it's 1 staffer for 182 refugees. And apart from whether UNRWA is perpetuating a status quo that does more harm than good, I think we need to look at the efficiencies of starting to, over time, requiring UNRWA to complete its mission, but then also to figure out how we can transition some of these things over to UNHCR.
If I may request time for Mr. Wexler to answer.
Thank you very much.
May I request time for Mr.
Sure.
Wexler to ask
Absolutely.
a question? Thank you.
Thank you. We need to assist the Palestinians and the Arab world with respect to their stubborn view of the right of return to move to a more helpful position. And in this regard, President Abbas deserves some credit. Not too long ago, President Abbas was born in the Israeli city of Sfat, which is one of the 4 most important Jewish cities in history. And President Abbas was asked publicly, does he intend to return to his place of birth, Sfat, in Israel? And he said yes. But then he said, as a visitor. That was an incredible, incredible sign to his people that the Palestinian people will enjoy a right of return, but they'll enjoy it to the new state of Palestine. And the deal is, of course, a 2-state outcome, 1 Jewish, 1 Arab. The deal isn't 1.5 Arab states and half a Jewish state. But we've got to do things that allow the Palestinians with face-saving measure to move away from this decades, generations-long stubborn position.
Thank you, and I yield my time.
Thank you very much. I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Florida, Brian Mast, and before doing so, again, thank him for his distinguished service in Afghanistan and Kandahar. As I think my colleagues already know, he was seriously wounded. He was an explosive ordnance disposal expert, lost both of his legs and a finger, and obviously knows the price of freedom and is a true hero, and it is an honor to yield to him.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Don't forget that finger. That's an important part of it. I appreciate y'all giving us your time today. I wanted to start with you, Mr. Wexler. Every time you turn on your microphone, you speak with passion about the issue, and I absolutely appreciate that. You asked that we put these conversations about unfunding, defunding the UN in historical context of the presidents of past. And in that same breath, you also mentioned that Israeli behavior has not been helpful. And just now you made the comment about allowing Palestinians to save face. And I was just looking for a short answer on, can you tell me, has there been any not helpful behavior that's warranted the behavior seen rocket attacks, stabbings, vehicular manslaughter, anything?
All of it. Atrocious. Horrible. Palestinians and their leadership have defrauded their own people for decades, for generations. And the flip side, there's Israeli behavior that is quite favorable. People forget that Prime Minister Netanyahu made a speech at Bar-Ilan University and advanced the cause of a two-state solution. He then implemented a settlement freeze under the watch of Senator Mitchell and his effort. First time an Israeli prime minister adopted a settlement freeze to that degree. This is a mixed bag. There are good and very positive actions by the Israeli government, and most of all, Israel's a miracle state. It's an extraordinary achievement of democracy, human rights, respect for minorities. They have a Supreme Court where there are Arab members on the Supreme Court. The Israeli forces do what few forces in the world do, Americans do. They go and help the enemy obtain health care coverage. I believe Israel just allowed in as refugees Syrian children that are the victims of what's happening in Syria. Israel's a miracle country. They have everything to be proud of. All I'm suggesting is that in the context of analyzing this resolution, we recognize both the pros and the cons. In the case of Israel, it's 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1, the pros versus the cons.
Very good. I'm glad you answered that with passion again. You know, I open this up really to anybody that wants to take the time to answer it. You know, I can say I've learned personally in my life, leadership absolutely matters. You know, when I had leaders in the military that displayed courage, valor, selflessness, moral resolve, they drew the exact same thing out of me, out of every person to our left and right. Most of us can certainly probably agree, you know, in this day and age that that's something that matters. You know, you mentioned, Dr. Shazner, that the PA is in their 12th year of a 4-year term, the leader of the PA. It's a regime that really has presided year over year over terror. Could you point to any specific leaders that you would want to see line up to be the next leader, people that we should be looking at to line up there? And do you see a vessel to move there more quickly, or is this simply wait it out, as you talked about, a 2-pack-a-day smoker? Do we just wait this out? What's your take on that?
Unfortunately, it's a bit of a waiting game. Abbas has really purged a lot of that next level leadership. Look, there are people that I think we can still look to. Salam Fayyad, for example, the former prime minister who Mr. Wexler mentioned, is an excellent leader, someone who's really committed to transparency, fighting corruption, against terrorism. He's still around. He's been marginalized, but he's still around. I have concerns about some of the other PLO leadership that I think are lining up and they believe that they may be able to succeed Abbas. Thinking about Saeb Erekat, the very vitriolic spokesperson for the PLO, that would be, I think, the exact wrong person to see step into that role. So I think we need to be trying to shape this right now and perhaps through our diplomatic presence in the Middle East, try to identify perhaps some of the leaders who may come up and at least ensure that there's a debate going on properly within the Palestinian political spectrum.
Very good. Is there anybody else that would like to offer up any? Please, by all means.
I'll be quick. Ideally, the answer to your question would be the Palestinian people should decide in a free and democratically held election. Ideally, that's what should happen. Of course, the last time that happened, one of the few times it's happened in the context of the Palestinians, Hamas prevailed. So if we're going to advance democratic reform and hope for it genuinely, as we should, we've also got to empower those that advance a more moderate agenda to be victorious at the ballot box. Now, that's not our obligation, that's not our responsibility, but we need to be smart enough to understand that in the current environment, it's the extremists that tend to take advantage of the situation when there's no diplomatic horizon that seems realistic to them, to the Palestinian people, that is.
Very good. Thank you again for your comments.
Could I just make one? On your point about leadership at the UN, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I think that American leadership or, I mean, your options are kind of American leadership or back foot diplomacy. And I think that when you work from your back foot, you create this permissive environment. that causes some of the UN funds and programs to behave badly. And so when we are always leading in these various bodies, whether it's especially in the in the UN Security Council, where we set the agenda and we make very clear that there will be consequences in the bilateral relationship for people who try to hijack the agenda. And that's how you prevent a lot of things coming into the Security Council that have no business being there. But that requires a perm rep and a team and an administration that fully supports that and a president that believes in it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi.
I want to thank the witnesses. They're really brilliant people and really great insights that you've given today. And the two-state solution was first explained to me by Shimon Peres when I visited Israel back in 2002 during the Second Intifada after the massacre in Hebron. And I'm a very strong supporter of the two-state solution. In my maiden speech on the House floor, I supported Resolution 11 and was one of the original co-sponsors of this bipartisan objection to the U.S. abstention from UN Security Resolution 2334, because I believe that the abstention pushes us further away from a two-state solution. So today's really about the UN, and I'm going to just take some of your quotes. I came in late, so I don't have quotes from each of you, but I have a very strong agreement that the UN has a systemic unjust bias against Israel, as was stated by one of you earlier. And I believe, however, that the UN would be a much more, and these different committees would be much more hostile bodies without our presence on them. And I have the hope that the UN will live up to its intentions of its founding nations. I don't like the idea of conditioning money. I don't like the idea of withdrawing money from the UN. So I want to ask each of you, and I'm just going to ask you in no more than 45 seconds apiece, to give me what you think the one best way to reform the UN, which we all agree has some serious problems as far as efficiency, as far as its bias against Israel, all these different areas. If you had one thing that you could pick as a reform other than withdrawing money or conditioning money, what would be the one thing that you would suggest that we could do to try and reform the UN? So, Mr. Neuer.
I think some things are beyond our capacity. There are UN entities that are controlled by member states, and we may have no leverage over some of those member states when they act in unison. But it was mentioned before the role of the Secretary General. When the UN Human Rights Council had Richard Falk as its special rapporteur on Palestine, a notorious 9/11 conspiracy theory supporter, and when he supported the 9/11 conspiracy theory, Ban Ki-moon condemned him openly. That completely discredited him. So the U.S. was not able to remove Richard Falk, but by getting Ban Ki-moon to condemn him, and Ban Ki-moon's office acknowledged that it was because he was coming to Congress that week that he felt compelled to make that statement. And Richard Falk, who retired a couple of years ago, continues to lament the fact that his own boss condemned him. So I think it's an example of how there are some things that the U.S. cannot stop, but they can remedy, they can limit by getting the Secretary General, we have a new one, to speak out. And I think that's something that the U.S. should insist that the new Secretary General does on a regular basis.
So keeping that relationship and enhancing that relationship could actually be effective in helping to get him to do what we want. So, Mr. Hook, what are you thinking?
I would say two things. The UN needs a more equitable allocation of operating costs. It is unhealthy for the UN to rely on one donor to the extent that it does. I think we need to be, as part of our bilateral agenda with our allies, and even with China and Russia, they have to pay more. And there needs to be a better allocation of costs, and we can encourage that. The UN is never going to require them. We're not going to be able to change the funding formula in the General Assembly. So that's going to require us to be making it a priority with other nations to voluntarily spend more money at the UN so that we're not spending so much of it. The other thing that I think...
You're not giving me my answer, though. So you're saying you want to reduce the money that we spend.
No. What I'm saying is other people need to pay more of the fair share.
So your concern is the percentage?
Yes.
Okay.
And then the other thing I think we can look at is, we spend $2.5 billion on the peacekeeping missions. And we have supported Japan and India as permanent members, non-veto, but for the Council. I think we should require that any new permanent member should be required to pay a substantial share of the UN peacekeeping budget as a condition to become permanent members.
So you'd be supportive of the idea of the U.S. keeping its contributions the way it is, but increasing others so that our percentage was less, and encouraging any new members to put up money, thereby also helping us with our percentage?
I like a good calibration of like cost benefit generally. I don't like kind of a one size fits all. If there is a program that is, the UN, 70% of its budget is spent on personnel. That seems to be an area where we can reduce UN costs, and by doing that, we get to reduce US costs because we're the biggest funder.
I appreciate that. I'm a CPA, just so you know. And I was a mayor and a county executive. So it helped. Go ahead.
With respect to Mr. Hook, I actually think that right now does leverage and actually gives us more of a say in how the UN should reform, and so I think we ought to take advantage of that while it's going on.
Yeah.
I think that I mentioned a few things in my testimony.
I saw those 4 things that you picked. You only get to pick one.
Right. So well,
for now.
Those 4 are great, but look, I think a big picture, you need like a consulting firm to get in there, and you need to get in there and root out corruption. You need to see where waste is. You need to see where redundancy is. You want to see where they're effective and where they're not. And I think if you could do that, you'd probably cut out 30–40% of the UN's budget. You'd probably make a lot of people very unhappy. But if you ran the UN like a business,
well, you never run it like a business, same as you won't run the U.S. government like a business, because there's no profit motive and a whole bunch of other things. But you're just suggesting if we could get some smart people to actually come from the outside and be more efficient.
Insiders are deeply corrupt, and I am very skeptical. From the outside, you might be able to make some change.
How would we go about getting that done?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, the UN would have to agree to that.
Yeah, but, okay. Mr. Wexler?
There's a new sheriff in town, President Trump, and we have Republican leadership of the House and the Senate that is critical, to say the least, of the United Nations. I would make it clear that America essentially has 2 red lines in terms, particularly as it relates to this issue, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Number 1, that the United States will not tolerate any UN action behavior that advances BDS, because at its core it's anti-Semitic. Also, I would make it clear that rather than a negative perspective that the UN often has had in terms of its dealings with Israel, that we incorporate, in effect, what Prime Minister Netanyahu has argued, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a conflict about historical narratives. He's right. And the UN needs to reflect the fact that countries in the world need to stop delegitimizing Israel, and they need to recognize Israel's right to exist. If I were President Trump, I would speak with the new Secretary General and basically tell him I'm all with you. I'm with you 110%. I'd give you 2 years. 2 years to change the mentality of the UN. And if you can do it in a demonstrated way, I'm your best friend forever. And I'll be behind you in that manner. But if you can't, then there will be consequences. And I don't think you need to lay out those consequences. And I don't think we need to get that far. And I think we should give the new Secretary General, who's in fact very sensitive to these issues, and give our new UN ambassador, who also needs time to maneuver the scenario, to improve things.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mark Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for, some of you for being back with us. It's good to see you again. We will disagree sometimes on the strategy and tactic, Mr. Wexler, but I certainly appreciate your candor and your willingness not only to have served in this body, but certainly to continue to serve as an expert witness here today. I'm not as optimistic as the gentleman from New York in terms of reform ever happening in the UN without a leverage point. And having been a delegate to the UN, having seen up close and personal, having also seen that in the previous administration, which was had a reformer in there who truly wanted reform, there is no way that you're going to reform something where you have the very member states themselves participating in a jobs program that actually gives jobs to those who are well connected by the very member states. They're just not going to do it. They have control over the 70% of the budget that actually employs many of the people that are associated with the very people making the decision. Would you agree with that? It's a softball.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So if indeed we can't reform it from within because there is an incentive among the member states, the pressure that you just talked about coming from President Trump about really needing reform actually has to take on some kind of conduit for that reform other than a resolution from the Congress that has no real effect. Now, do you think the resolution that we passed is setting all kinds of people at the UN? Are they running around saying, oh my gosh, we better change it because members of Congress put forth a resolution?
Maybe
just answer yes or no. Are they running around based on that resolution?
I apparently have more confidence in President Trump than you may have.
Oh, no. I can assure you that that's probably not the case. But in doing that, having someone that's here we've got to do more than resolutions. I am tired of every single time we having an anti-U.S., anti-Israel UN consistently voting against us when we're the main funder, percentage-wise, of any country. And so the message for the UN, if they're looking in on this hearing today, is that you suggest 2 years, I suggest 12 months. The time is now for reform. We have introduced a bill, 802, that actually looks at taking some of the U.S. foreign aid dollars away from Senegal because they were a sponsor of the most recent resolution. If they're going to attack our friend and ally Israel, this bill actually takes the money and just moves it over to 2 pro-Israel African countries. Doesn't even cut money, it just says we're going to move it over. It is time that our friends are recognized as our friends and our enemies are recognized as our enemies. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Sure.
All right. So if that's the case.
May I add something, though?
Yes, you may. Since I was doing more of the talking, you go ahead.
I've been talking all morning.
I know. And I like it. That's all right. Go ahead.
You brought out, I think, an important point in the first part of your remark, which is this is about the member states.
Right.
The truth is the UN is just a venue.
Right.
It's the actions of the member states that need to be changed. And you're right, a resolution by this committee or this Congress, as well-intentioned, as important as it is not going to change, most likely, the actions of the member states. But a president of the United States who's engaged on these issues and an effective UN ambassador who pursues this line of engagement on a continual basis can make a big difference. And it needs to be tied into the overall strategy of the country on foreign policy. But may I offer one word of caution? And I hesitate to say this. I am a Zionist to the core. One of the reasons I am so patriotic about this country is because I'm a Jewish American.
Right.
And no time in history have Jewish Americans or Jews had the opportunity to live as well as we have in this country. It gives me pause when an institution as important as the UN and a country as immensely important as the United States begins to offer as an absolute condition our relations, examples regarding only Israel. This world is huge. There are so many interests. The worst thing for the Jewish people?
I've got you. Now, we can get into a very wide and expansive list of areas for reform that have nothing to do with Israel, and I'll be glad to have another hearing on that when we look at that, because you mentioned peacekeeping. I mean, once we have a peacekeeper in place, they never go away. You know, when we really look at the UN, we put up peacekeeping missions all over, and we've got peacekeepers in places that are not appropriated properly. And I support that. And I guess what you're saying is you've got a fiscal conservative member of Congress who loves foreign policy, who understands it, who's willing to invest in it, and yet at the same time, I'm tired of allocating funds and getting the same results over and over and over again. Does that make sense? So your point's well taken. We won't be myopic in our focus here. So let me the chairman's being generous with his time, so let me come back the other way. There have been credible reports that the U.S. participated in this particular resolution and the vote. And by credible, I mean some unimpeachable in terms of our willingness to allow this particular UN resolution to happen. Doctor, are you aware of those, and what kind of message does that send if indeed the very ally of Israel is allowing that and participating in that?
I'm obviously aware there was quite a bit of controversy about that at the time. The reports were several. There was a report that came out in an Egyptian newspaper alleging that the the Palestinians were sitting down with the United States under Egyptian auspices, and there may have been actually even more than one meeting where this took place, where they were guiding the language, guiding the process from the White House. There were indications that there could have been pressure on Ukraine to vote in favor of this. And the Israelis have indicated that they are certain that there was U.S. involvement. I think at this point there's probably not a whole lot of debate over whether the White House was involved. I think the inclination of the White House was to, as they say, lead from behind, to let other people take charge of the process and that they could inform it from the sidelines. I think regardless of exactly how it played out, the end result was the same. The abstention did the damage. They could have voted for it. They could have abstained. It doesn't matter. The United States lowered the shield, as we would say. They lowered the shield at the UN and allowed for this resolution to go through. The resolution, I think, was harmful, and will take some time to undo that damage.
Well, thank you, Doctor. We're going to raise back that shield, and I appreciate the chairman's indulgence.
Mr. Meadows, thank you very, very much for your participation. I'd like to, Mr. Deutsch and I are just going to ask a few follow-up questions, and then we'll conclude the hearing. Let me just first ask on UNESCO. The arrearage now is approximately $500 million, and obviously UNESCO is unhinged. It is moving even more aggressively in promoting anti-Semitic policies. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what your recommendations would be to the Congress and to the President on what we do next with UNESCO. Secondly, Dr. Schanzer, you mentioned a performance enhancement plan in answer to a question earlier. I've been in Congress 37 years, and we have talked about UN reform going back to Nancy Kassenbaum. Attorney General Dick Thornburg sat right where you are sitting right now in 1993, when Tom Lantos and I and Doug Beeryder and others asked a series of important questions. The former U.S. Attorney General at the time was the Undersecretary for Management at the UN, made sweeping reforms in the realm of inspectors generals that would be independent and whistleblower protections. As I said in my opening remarks, we continue to labor against whistleblowers being retaliated against at the UN, and IGs are far from a standard that any democracy worth its salt would say is an IG. So the UN has failed miserably, in my opinion, in that regard. So your thoughts on, as Mr. Meadows said, patience has run out. We need to get this right. And the Human Rights Council, as I said in my earlier questioning, what a missed opportunity to have an organization to speak truth to power, especially to dictatorships, and it has just fumbles the ball and goes after Israel with agenda item number 7. So those couple of questions, and then I'll yield to my friend, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. With UNESCO, I think it is undeniable that the leverage which the U.S. government gained by cutting funds to UNESCO in regard to other UN bodies that the Palestinians would have joined were it not for the fear of triggering those kinds of dramatic consequences in Paris where 1/5 of the staff had to be cut many nations were angry at the Palestinians for triggering that. I think that played a singular role in blocking Palestinian efforts to politicize the World Health
Gentlemen,
Organization.
yield just briefly and then continue. I get what Mr. Wexler said about member states, but many of the specialized agencies, those where, and that is an assessment contribution once you're a part of it, but so many of the other agencies are voluntary contributions, and I think your point is a very important one to underscore, that when we send a message and we mean it with our funding and with our actions, it does have a laudatory impact perhaps on others, but we got to work on the member states, no doubt, Mr. Wexler. But these specialized agencies can't be moonlighting as they do so often against Israel. So please continue.
Thank you. I believe the U.S. should consult with its allies, including Israel and other close allies, about the value of its continued membership in UNESCO. The United States was not a member for some 25 years. I'm not aware of any significant loss to humanity as a result of that absence. Actually, a senior official of the Obama administration told me that an agency like the World Health Organization, which actually does important work, would matter to have the U.S. there, and if it cut its funds, whereas UNESCO, she did not think that that was actually a consequential body. I do want to make one point about the Human Rights Council. We, UN Watch, are the strongest critic of the Human Rights Council. I've regrettably spent 13 years there. I work across the street, and so I know its dangers very well. I would say that in this instance, the Human Rights Council is not going away. And from 2006 to 2009, the U.S. left, although it did signal its displeasure with the body and denied it a certain form of legitimacy. It continued to do its negative work. It created the Goldstone Report. It feeds into the ICC. I actually believe that we should have a Moynihan. I'd like to have a Patrick Moynihan type of figure who would come, not like Ambassador Powers cited Moynihan when she came before the Congress, but didn't always act like him, but to have someone who would come to the Human Rights Council, pick up the phone to the High Commissioner and say, if you do X, Y, or Z, you're in a lot of trouble. Someone who would speak out for human rights. I don't think that kind of presence would give one iota of legitimacy, and the Obama administration did become a cheerleader of the council. That was wrong. But someone who would come to the council and take the floor, as Moynihan did in the Zionism is racism debate, would actually be a contribution to human rights and to combating anti-Israel bias. So I would like to see the new administration send an ambassador of that nature. Thank you.
I'm going to leave UNESCO to my colleagues. I don't want to call myself an expert on that, although I would say that UNESCO knew exactly what was going to happen once it allowed itself to become politicized through the so-called Palestine 194 campaign. And I think it's a cautionary tale that as soon as these agencies become part of this broader campaign, they're used for purposes that I think extend well beyond what they are designed to do. That's exactly what happened with UNESCO. I'm fearful that it can happen with others as well. I think we should be mindful of that. We should be watching out for that and trying to prevent it to the extent that that's possible. Look, as for the performance enhancement plan that you mentioned, I don't have specifics. I mean, I probably should sit down for a few weeks and come up with a study on it. But I think that, as I mentioned before, the fact that we've already put the UN on notice, I think you're already seeing a shift in tone. And I think we ought to double down on that. I think we ought to continue to press the UN, letting them know that funding is not guaranteed, letting them know that reform is necessary, and start to really lay out specifics where we want to see some of that reform. I mentioned 4 areas where I think we could probably enact reform. I'm sure my colleagues here can probably come up with another dozen. But this ought to be part of the plan. And so it's not just cutting, right? What you say is, look, we need you to do the following things, and if you don't within a certain amount of time, then we're going to start to talk about cutting. And in other words, you sequence this. You can message it a little bit in a way that lets the UN know that this is not a free ride. I think that's incredibly important. That, and I think getting in there and actually rooting out corruption, because I think there's a huge amount of waste that happens year after year. I remember the oil for food scandal. I think that was probably just the tip of the iceberg.
I would associate myself with these remarks. I think they're excellent. And I think it's incredibly important, it's worth repeating what the new Secretary General did this week, which is for the world to hear. He said that the Jewish connection to Jerusalem, the Jewish connection through the temple in Jerusalem, is undeniable. That is a complete condemnation of the completely irrational, bigoted, discriminatory hatred that has come from certain parts of the UN system. So in an overall sense now, you all have a choice. You could empower that man who seems instinctively and substantively to share most, if not all, of your concerns, or you can take the knees out from underneath them. That's your choice as policymakers. I would say empower them, and also what was suggested before. President Trump's got to incorporate this strategy into his trade deals when he's negotiating. When the Palestinians, after the UN Secretary General said what he said, and they criticized the UN Secretary General, there needs to be a strong shot back that the new sheriff in town's not gonna take that irrational type of responses anymore. Don't expect to get money if you're gonna deny the Jewish connection to Jerusalem, because it doesn't serve your cause. But there also has to be positive reinforcement as well. If you're going to do some good things, there's got to be some reward for it as well. And we've got to stand for those positive, rewarding things, which means stand strongly for a two-state outcome, a two-state negotiated outcome. We can't be seen as being allied with the unfortunate statements most recently by Prime Minister Netanyahu when he talked about a Palestinian state minus. Well, if you're talking about a Palestinian state minus, how do you encourage the Palestinians to do the right thing? That's tough.
Yes, we transcribed the interview that Mr. Wexler just referred to, where the Secretary General did make positive statements about fighting anti-Semitism and about the temple, acknowledging that there was a Jewish temple that the Romans destroyed. I would not overstate, however, what he said. It was a passing reference in response to a question by Israel Radio's Benny Avni. In that same interview, he was asked specifically on the point that you, Chairman Smith, mentioned about the 3D test. Mr. Avni asked the Secretary General, would you acknowledge, as many Jews do, that anti-Semitism today often adopts the cloak of singling out Israel for differential and discriminatory treatment, demonizing Israel, and he refused to accept any notion that anti-Semitism has any connection with a double standard with Israel. So I do agree with Mr. Wexler that we should encourage the positive statements. I would not agree that it was a complete condemnation of the UNESCO statement. Actually, Irina Bokova, the director of UNESCO, did make very positive statements that were overt and direct and were, I would say, a complete condemnation. His were not. And there were some statements he made about the discriminatory treatment of Israel where he didn't acknowledge the nature of the bias. So yes, reinforce, but don't give a free pass. Continue to hold him and other UN officials accountable. What Mr. Guterres and what Ms. Bokova will say can be very significant in defanging resolutions that we can't otherwise stop.
Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, and thanks again to the witnesses. This is a really helpful discussion. Representative Wexler, I just want to go back to something you said in your prepared comments. We didn't really get a chance to talk about the rest of the hearing, and that's the positive reaction from the Arab states to the principle of two states for two peoples. Israel obviously finds itself sharing many of the same security concerns as its Arab neighbors, and there is an opportunity for greater involvement by the Arab states in helping to move the peace process forward. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on what those opportunities are, but I'd also like to hear your thoughts on the difficulties in continuing those discussions with those Arab states. If I could turn, there's been a lot of discussion about the prior administration, if I could turn to the current administration for a second, in light of an executive order that slams the door on all refugees and that bans every person from 7 Muslim countries from coming into the United States, and that, as Senator McCain and Senator Graham have said, helps terrorist recruitment. How do we do both of these things? How do we continue to work to develop what might be a positive contribution from these Arab states at the same time that we're working in a world where we've made a very powerful and dramatic statement about how we may view that part of the world, certainly those 7 Muslim countries?
That's a huge question. It's undeniable that the dynamic in the region has changed for the better, in the sense that the Sunni Arab states find themselves with a confluence of interests with Israel that didn't exist even a few years ago. And that is played out with intensely close security relations, informal economic relations, and just generally a whole sense of collaboration and cooperation. But there's a glass ceiling here. Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israelis rightfully point out that if one thing the Arab Spring should have taught us is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not central to the problems in the Arab world. We could resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict tomorrow. Syria will still be in the mess that it's in. Yemen will have its problems. Iran will still be pursuing a nuclear weapon. All the problems of the Muslim and Arab world will exist. However, there's a converse to this. We and Israel and our Arab allies will not be able to collaborate and coordinate in the way in which we could in a positive way unless the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in fact established. We should have our embassy in Jerusalem. We should. But you know what? It should get there when we have a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, so that not only our embassy goes there, but that 100+ more go there, and that we lead an extraordinary effort. My point is this. We can cherry pick out certain aspects to support our closest ally, Israel. But I would respectfully suggest that the best way to support Israel is to build a dynamic in which they can, in fact, engage in the way a normal nation engages with its neighbors. And we're ready for that. We're ripe for that. And so what we need to do is be sensitive to the interests of, for instance, the King of Jordan, who was here this week, who I think in private told President Trump the problems he would have if we moved our embassy to Jerusalem. Now, we can weigh that. We can say it's not important enough. But the King of Jordan's a huge ally to us. And why make his life difficult in a way that doesn't achieve the type of result that ultimately we and Israel are looking for, which is a negotiated two-state outcome?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry I need to go, but I will yield the balance of my time to Mr. O'Connell.
I'll recognize, of course. Gentleman from Virginia, thank you.
Thank you.
Is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Deutsch. When I was here a little earlier, Mr. Noor, and forgive me, I had to go back and forth to hearings, I thought I heard you refer to 5 million so-called refugees. Were you questioning the refugee status of individuals in the region?
Yes, it was in reference to the so-called Palestinian refugees.
So-called?
Yes, I work across the street from the UNHRC, the Human Rights, the UN High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR. They have definitions for refugees. It does not continue for generations. And only UNRWA gives that status.
Right. So I just want to make sure I understood you. Got it. Mr. Wexler, are they so-called refugees?
No, they are refugees, but it is true that only in the case of Palestinian refugees are second, third, and fourth generation members considered refugees. In other refugee situations, the refugee status stops at the actual refugee itself. And this is a complicated question with many factors, not the least of which are how are those refugees, however you define them, treated in the Arab countries? Pretty poorly, for the most part, except for Jordan. They don't get citizenship. They don't have the ability to entertain their lives in an economically feasible way. So what we've talked about in part today are some measures in which the United Nations can encourage the refugees that are in the West Bank to begin to be handled by the Palestinian Authority so as to change the stubborn ideology, which is a thorn in the side of a negotiated two-state outcome. But it's only one of several issues.
I hate to put you on the spot, Mr. Wexler, but I'm going to, since you were a member of this body. The U.S. ambassador to Israel designate, Mr. Friedman, has referred to critics of Israel, Jewish critics of Israel, in organizations like J Street as capos, or worse than capos. What is your comment about that kind of statement?
Any reference by anyone in that regard would be terribly unfortunate. With respect to the position of the American ambassador to Israel, and particularly in the case of the designee, who is a Jewish American, he has an opportunity to unite the Jewish American community and the whole pro-Israel American community, which is very large, thank goodness, very large. He has an opportunity to put us all in the same tent. And I would beg him to consider using language and actions that allow more people to root for him, as opposed to wonder the type of things that you are legitimately wondering now.
He is also not a fan, and that's being charitable, of a two-state solution, and has aligned himself with the settler movement and with specific settlements in Israel well beyond the environs of Jerusalem. Is the two-state solution dead, given the fact that we have a prime minister who off and on has said various things about two-state solution, and now we have a U.S. ambassador designate who's no fan of the two-state solution? Is it a fiction that we're pursuing? And what does that mean if we're going to give up on two-state solution?
I hope it's not dead, but anybody with any sense about them understands the dire scenario that we're in. And we're in a scenario where, for a whole host of reasons, both on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, the realization of a negotiated two-state outcome is further away today than ever before. The consequences are dire. For those of us who are Zionists, for those of us who believe in a Jewish democratic state of Israel, the creation of a demilitarized Palestinian state is not a gift to the Palestinians. It is a life preserver for a Jewish democratic state of Israel that is secure. So that's why I'm so passionate about the creation of a demilitarized Palestinian state within the context of a negotiated two-state outcome. Because if we don't have it, over time, Israel will become likely a binational state. And when it becomes a binational state, it will either lose its Jewish majority or its democratic nature. I want the state of Israel to be able to go forward and continue its miraculous growth from a position of strength. And obviously, it doesn't matter what I want. The Israeli people hopefully will choose that direction. They need a partner. And for those Americans at this point that are ascending to important positions, I think the notion that they would somehow discount a negotiated two-state outcome is very, very dangerous to the Zionist dream. And I hope as they learn more and more, they will moderate their tone and work towards a negotiated two-state outcome, because to do otherwise will doom the Zionist enterprise.
I completely share your point of view. As somebody who's a strong supporter of Israel, I worry about the future. I think we need vigorous debate about the future, and I don't think any purpose is served by calling people capos who dare to criticize the current government of the State of Israel. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Connolly. Mr. Hook, I think you wanted to make a comment.
Congressman Connolly brought up the point about the definition of...
I'm so sorry. I didn't, forgive me. I didn't mean to cut you off. Thank you, Chris.
I think part of the confusion is that when UNRWA was set up in 1949, it created a definition of refugee, which was a person whose normal place of residence between 46 and 48, and who lost his home and his livelihood as a result of the conflict. That was the definition. It was UNRWA later expanded and redefined the definition of refugee to include descendants. And so most of the people in the original definition, many of them are deceased, but then they changed the definition of refugee. And that's why we've got this fusion.
Yes, and I wasn't putting any back. I was simply, I heard it, and then I had to run, and I wanted to make sure I heard it correctly and what you meant. And I think you clarified that.
And if I could clarify that it is not my position that these individuals don't need help and that the U.S. and other countries should not provide the aid. The question is how. The problem with UNRWA is not only our 130-page report about incitement to terrorism and anti-Semitism. The problem with UNRWA is a core problem with its underlying message. The question is, how are 2 million Palestinian refugees in Gaza and West Bank, how are they refugees if they've come from mandatory Palestine? And if they're in Gaza and the West Bank today, where are they refugees from? They're in mandatory Palestine. They're in what the UN calls the state of Palestine. Where are they refugees from? And it relates to what Mr. Wexler had said. The PA could address them. We could give the funds to the PA and let them be handled. The problem is that UNRWA's narrative is that their home is not in Gaza, their home is in Israel. And so we should not be surprised that when we give cement, when the international community gives cement to Palestinians in Gaza, rather than use it to build homes, hospitals, and schools, they've been taught by UNRWA that their home is in Israel. And so we shouldn't be surprised that they take that cement and build terror tunnels to attack Israel.
And I take your point, Mr. Noor, but I would go back to what Mr. Wexler said. Abandoning, not that you did, but abandoning a two-state solution, I guarantee you, will not make that better. If we have any hope at all of ultimately dealing with status of those folks who are called refugees by UNRWA, I think you've got to continue to put some capital into the two-state solution, or risk perpetual conflict and personal animus that will just never go away.
I take your point, and I think, you know, on the issue of settlements, for example, we have said in Resolution 2334 says that settlements are an obstacle to peace. The fact is that Israel, as it did this week and as it has done on numerous times with the Camp David Accords and then in the disengagement from Gaza, Israel has uprooted thousands of its own citizens from their homes and uprooted and dismantled settlements. And what no one talks about, Dr. Einat Wilf, who's writing a book on UNRWA, one of the world experts, says that dismantling settlements has happened. Israel has done it. But how do you dismantle an idea? And the idea that Israel has no right to exist, the idea in every UNRWA school that Israel is erased from the map, and in our report there are pictures of UNRWA schools in Syria and all over where Israel is erased from the map. To uproot an idea that Israel has no right to exist is much harder, and that idea is the obstacle to peace.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's a terrible dilemma and has to be overcome, and sooner or later the Palestinian community has to come to grips with the existence of Israel, as a number of Israel's neighbors have. But aggressive expansion of settlements way beyond the environments of suburban Jerusalem is not only a provocative act, it is potentially a destabilizing act. And to Mr. Wexler's point, it could backfire. It could actually damage Israel's stability on its borders and destabilize nations that have recognized Israel's right to exist, such as Jordan. And that's in no one's interest. I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, one final thing Mr. Wexler wanted to comment, and then I'm done. I thank you.
With respect to settlements, Mr. Noor is factually correct. Israel has, in fact, removed settlements at least 2 points in history. Prime Minister Sharon from Gaza, which was, what, 8,000 or 9,000 Israelis, and the Israelis, as a condition of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, removed Jewish settlements from the Sinai, effectively. Those were relatively small numbers of people. We now have, if you add up East Jerusalem and the West Bank, close to 600,000 Jewish residents. Now, I think the most...
And excuse me, but in when President Bill Clinton was in office in 1993, I believe the number was a little over 100,000?
I think it was more than that, but the growth has been substantial. And in fairness, let's not just pin it on Prime Minister Netanyahu. The growth was substantial in labor governments. The growth has been substantial in all Israeli-led governments. The key is that we begin to distinguish between settlements. It's true, settlements are not a block to a negotiated two-state outcome. Those settlements that are adjacent to the 67 lines are certainly not a block. They can be incorporated into Israel with land swaps rather easily. But settlements that are way out, in fact, do impair the realization of a negotiated two-state outcome. If it's only 6,000 people or 8,000 people, you can deal with it. But when it gets into 50,000, 60,000, it becomes a logistical nightmare and a political nightmare for any Israeli government.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. Connolly?
Thank you.
Before we close, I would like to offer an opportunity if there's a question that went unasked or something, concluding remark you might want to make. If not, that's fine. But, you know, Mr. Wexler, you made a very good point about demilitarized. I think that word needs to be underscored. That's the biggest worry. I remember being on the White House lawn, and I'm sure you were, and so many of my colleagues were, when Rabin, Arafat, and President Clinton, you know, looked like it was truly an historic accord, the Oslo Accord. But I remember riding back from that very important ceremony thinking, but what about the terrorism and people with AK-47s and then some? And we know that Hamas has only gotten more dominant rather than less. So that remains obviously a deep, deep concern. And I get your point. It was very well spoken and articulated as to why you think, you know, that is the way to go. But it has to be demilitarized. But anybody would like to make some final comment before we close, or we'll just end? Yes, Mr. Doerr.
Yeah, just one comment. There was a question about some systemic reforms we could make, and I think one of the most important ones would be transparency and supporting whistleblowers. We just had this week another UN human rights official who said that she was punished for revealing that a senior supervisor in her office gave China information about Cao Shunli, the dissident who was about to come to Geneva and who, as you know, was detained and died in prison. And it seems that a senior UN human rights official in Geneva gave the information to China and was doing that on a regular basis. So the whistleblowers need to be protected, and the Congress is playing an important role on that. I think the new UN ambassador should try to create a system of freedom of information. It is almost impossible to get basic information. Things like who are the staffers who wrote the Goldstone report. By accident, we found out that one of the key authors was a woman named Dr. Gritje Bars, who is a Marxist radical professor in London, who was spokeswoman for the European flotilla, Gaza flotilla movement. She was actually one of the so-called impartial civil servants who were writing the Goldstone report. All of that information is hidden by the UN. We need to create a system where that kind of information gets disclosed as it would be in any other government. Thank you, Chairman Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Doerr. Mr. Wexler.
I just want to thank you and Chairperson Lehtinen and the ranking members for an especially thoughtful and well-run hearing. Thank you very much.
Doctor?
I also want to thank you for this hearing. I think it's been terrific. You know, we've obviously been focusing today on the UN's treatment of Israel and the corruption within and perhaps prospects for peace. But I think I should also point out here that the UN has other jobs to do. For example, the recent missile test by Iran, we're deeply concerned about that. We hope that the UN will address this. I know the administration just recently raised this in an emergency session. It's going to be crucial, I think, for Congress and the administration to ensure that the UN and the P5+1 holds Iran to account when we talk about Israel's security, when we talk about the security of the United States, global security. Iran has got to be job one. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to, again, thank you for your incisive commentary and testimony. The two subcommittees, we will be holding a hearing soon on UNRWA, and I think that will hopefully provide some good insights as to policy, next steps. And again, I want to thank you so much for your excellent testimonies. The hearing is adjourned.